"This is not a nightclub, you piece of trash," the manager snapped, and all of Regency Hall held its breath as Malik, the boy with steel braces on his legs, reached out a trembling hand toward Aisha, the black waitress. Adrian Stone, the powerful billionaire, slammed the table and shouted at his son, "You've shamed me in front of everyone!" But Aisha suddenly removed her apron and placed her hand in Malik's. "One dance doesn't kill anyone, sir." The whole hall reeled, eyes locked on that defiant moment, where a powerless child took the lead for the first time. Don't look away, because this isn't just a dance. It's a slap in the face of an entire empire's pride. On Saturday night, Regency Hall shimmered like a castle built of light, with crystal chandeliers casting a cold glow over every banquet table. Men in deep black tuxedos sat upright. Beside them, women in dazzling evening gowns, wine glasses swirling under the glow of the lights. The sound of cutlery clinking against pristine white porcelain, soft laughter, and conversations about deals, stocks, and power blended into a proud, polished hum. At the center, the largest table belonged to Adrian Stone, the man seen as untouchable in the business world, and his son, Malik. Adrian sat as if the entire room were his personal domain, his cold gaze surveying those around him, his rare, polite smile more a forced ritual than a gesture of warmth. Malik, the 12-year-old boy, sat next to his father. His legs were locked in shiny steel braces, each small movement making a sharp, clattering sound. He was rarely brought to public events, and this was the first time since the accident. The dazzling lights and the many eyes turned toward the father and son made him so tense that his small hand clutched the tablecloth, trembling. But then, a soft piano melody rose from the corner of the room, strangely gentle, touching a quiet place in his heart. Malik stood up, his chair sliding back with a slight scrape, drawing immediate glances. In that stunned silence, he stretched forward, his small hand trembling as it reached out. The person he chose was not some elegantly dressed lady, but Aisha, the black waitress standing nearby with a tray of drinks. At that moment, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the hall, everything frozen in confusion. The guests fell silent, chopsticks and wine glasses hanging mid-air. Malik, with legs bound in metal, offered a wordless invitation through his pleading eyes and outstretched arm. The restaurant manager, a man with slicked back hair, rushed over immediately. His voice sliced through the elegant atmosphere. "This is not the place for cheap stunts. Our staff are not here to entertain some child." The words were sharp as knives, jolting the room. Some guests covered their mouths to stifle laughter, and others shook their heads with pity. Adrian Stone sat frozen, fists clenched tightly under the table. He could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him, waiting for a cold, decisive move. Malik remained standing, his hand still suspended in the air, his eyes pleading. Aisha froze, her whole body tense. In 5 years of working at Regency Hall, she had learned how to be invisible, to follow orders, to avoid drawing attention. But in that terrifying silence, she could hear the sound of her own heart. The manager glared. "Aisha, return to your station now. Don't make me repeat myself." The air felt like it was about to explode. Adrian clenched his jaw, his voice low but filled with threat. "Malik, sit down." This command wasn't for the table, nor for manners, but to preserve the cold image of a billionaire. The whole room held its breath, everyone waiting to see who would break through the thick layer of ice. Whispers began to ripple out like circles on water, mirroring the curiosity and discomfort of the wealthy guests. Some men frowned, seeing this as an insult to the luxurious setting they paid to enjoy. The women in evening gowns stole glances, some sneering, others shivering slightly at the intensity in the boy's eyes. The entire room turned into a strange theater where all eyes focused on 3 figures from different worlds: a billionaire, a disabled boy, and a black waitress. Adrian felt his chest tightening, unaccustomed to losing control. In his life, every banquet, every deal, every opponent had bowed under his cold, decisive gaze. Yet now, right before him, a 12-year-old boy, his only son, was tearing it all down with the simplest gesture. Rage and the fear of humiliation tangled together, making each breath feel uneven. He wanted to shout, to shut everything down, but that pleading look held him in place. Aisha, meanwhile, was torn by 2 opposing voices in her head. One urged her to step away, to turn her back and protect the hard-earned job she had fought for. The other pushed her to seize this moment, a chance for a child to reclaim some lost dignity. In an instant, she saw herself as a little girl again, once shunned for her skin color, once laughed at for stepping onto a school stage. She knew what Malik needed, because she had once needed the same thing. And from that, fear slowly gave way to resolve. When she removed her apron and set it on the tray, the soft clink of metal echoed louder than than any bell. A few guests stared in shock, eyes wide as if witnessing blasphemy, while others quietly exhaled, as though finding a way out through her courage. Malik felt the warmth of Aisha's hand, his face flushed with emotion, lips moving without sound. That was enough. He knew he wasn't alone anymore. The music kept playing, piano notes now more tender, guiding every gaze to that moment. Regency Hall had never seen anything like it. In a place where everything was calculated to showcase power and status, a single moment had shattered every unspoken rule. No one cared about fine wine or gourmet dishes anymore. Every eye was fixed on the dance about to begin, and in that brilliant golden light, the image of a vulnerable child and a determined woman marked the beginning of a change no one in that room could have foreseen. The music in Regency Hall still played, but its tone had changed completely. The piano keys, once just background to the guests' laughter, now became a thin beam of light shining directly onto the center, where a small boy with legs locked in steel braces was struggling to stay upright. Malik clutched Aisha's hand tightly, his breathing rapid, his face tense as if standing before a cliff. The sound of metal scraping against the wooden floor screeched sharply, as if tearing through the heavy silence. Every step he took dragged a long metallic groan, like the resistance of the whole world pressing back. The entire room stood in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend how such a fragile child dared to break through the thick wall of silence and step forward under hundreds of cold stares. The guests began to murmur, first a few whispers, then spreading like an oil slick. "A billionaire's son, shamed like this?" a man sneered. "Better to hide him away. Why bring him here?" another hissed, eyes darting around as if seeking agreement. Smirks appeared on some faces. Red-painted lips whispered like they were gossiping over a broken object on display. They didn't watch with empathy, but as if witnessing some bizarre form of entertainment. Adrian Stone sat frozen, his hand gripping his wine glass so tightly that the dark red liquid trembled. He stared at his son with a mixture of anger and confusion. To Adrian, this event was never about family. It was a political game. He had built the image of an untouchable man, and now Malik was dragging him off that throne with every screech of metal against the floor. No longer able to hold back, he growled, each word dropping like a hammer. "Sit down. Don't disgrace me." His hoarse voice echoed across the hall, bringing every conversation to a halt. Malik flinched, his eyes wavering. He knew his father well, knew he never repeated a command once it had been given. But he also felt the warmth of Aisha's hand still holding his, giving him the courage he thought he had lost long ago. The mockery, the stares, his father's voice, all swirled into a storm threatening to tear apart his fragile resolve. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small flame burned on. He remembered the days when his mother was still alive, and how she used to say, "Let your heart lead, your legs are just the vehicle." That memory became the weapon that kept Malik standing. Aisha moved beside him, her steps slow and steady, neither pushing nor guiding. She knew this moment wasn't about showcasing skill or claiming the spotlight, but about letting the boy choose for himself. Malik lifted his foot. The brakes screeched again, but this time he didn't fear it. His eyes shone, and even the harsh laughter around him couldn't dim them. He smiled, a rare, radiant, proud smile, the kind Adrian hadn't seen since the accident. She didn't lead, only adjusted her pace to match his, letting Malik know he was the one guiding the dance. Every time he stumbled, she slowed down, turning his awkwardness not into failure, but into part of the music. The entire room now witnessed a paradox: a disabled child leading, and a black waitress following. In that moment, the invisible rules of society were turned upside down. The guests around the tables sat in shock, some faces hardened, others momentarily softened by the strength radiating through the room. A middle-aged man leaned over and whispered, "This is nothing but an insult to his father." The woman next to him clicked her tongue, but her eyes sparkled. "But look at him. He's alive again." For the first time that evening, silence no longer ruled, replaced by a mix of conflicting emotions. Adrian felt the blood rush to his face. He saw his son smiling, the smile he had longed for over the past 2 years. Yet that joy turned into fear, because he knew the moment he lost control, everything could spiral beyond his reach. He wanted to leap up, pull Malik back to his seat, end the spectacle before it shattered his reputation. But his legs felt nailed to the floor, and the weight of countless eyes stripped him of all will to act. For the first time in years, Adrian felt small, smaller than a child. Malik kept moving, each step heavy but resolute. The sound of steel hitting wood became a strange rhythm, merging with the piano into a raw, honest kind of music. Aisha bowed her head slightly, as if handing over the entire stage. The boy took a deep breath, focused all his strength on the next step, and even as his breath turned ragged, the smile never left his face. In that moment, all the mockery, the scorn, the anger were drowned out by the vitality shining from Malik's eyes. A disabled child, standing in the middle of a ballroom filled with elites, not bowing, but smiling and leading himself. That image etched itself into everyone's mind, a challenge to all the unspoken rules that had ruled the room for too long. Aisha knew they could throw her out at any moment, but her choice had already shaped a moment that could not be undone. When Malik stopped after a few steps, breathing hard, his face flushed but full of pride, Aisha nodded gently. The hall erupted in a wave of mixed reactions. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others clapped quietly, defying disapproving stares. Adrian sat frozen, his hand trembling on the table, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Malik tilted his head toward Aisha, then turned to his father, his smile still bright, pure, untouched by the harshness of the world. Aisha held on to that small hand, letting him lead, correcting nothing, imposing nothing, only following. And in a room built on power and judgment, a simple truth echoed. Sometimes real freedom begins with an unsteady step and someone who dares to trust. The atmosphere in Regency Hall wavered, as if the music and the lights no longer belonged to the same world. After the moment Malik took those first steps with Aisha, the guests' initial shock slowly shifted into a wave of whispers that overpowered the sound of the piano. A woman with soft waves in her hair, draped in glittering jewelry, leaned toward her tablemate and smirked. She'll be sweeping sidewalks tomorrow. Her voice rang loud enough for others to hear, carrying no effort to hide her contempt. A few chuckles followed, not from genuine amusement, but the cold, empty laughter of people used to decorating their power with someone else's shame. Adrian sat motionless, but every word pierced his ears. The mockery hit like nails against his skin, sparking both fury and a desperate urge to deny. He hated the pitying looks thrown at his son, but he hated even more being seen as a man who had lost control. All his life, Adrian had been known as the unyielding one, never bending to anyone, and now, here he was, reduced to someone else's spectacle in the very place where he used to be the center of gravity. His hand trembled, his wineglass nearly shattered, but he forced himself to remain composed. The restaurant manager, frozen in place until now, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his tone cutting through the room, louder than anything else. Aisha, return to your station at once. You'll face disciplinary action. Have you forgotten the rules of this establishment? His voice rang firm, each word seemingly forged from resentment. In the manager's eyes, Aisha had committed the unforgivable, not just disrupting the tone of the evening, but daring to step beyond the lowly place he always reminded her to stay in. Aisha lifted her head, her gaze no longer trembling. She knew she could lose her job, suffer consequences, and be punished. But in that moment, the fear seemed to fall away. Her eyes met Adrian, a look she had avoided all evening. But this time she didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see whether she would fold under authority or choose defiance. She spoke slowly, every word clear and impossible to ignore. You can buy everything, but you can't buy this child's dignity. Her voice sliced through the air like a blade, severing all whispers. The guests who had been laughing fell silent, their faces tightening, some eyes darting away. The woman who mocked earlier lowered her wineglass, her hand frozen mid-air. No one had expected a server, someone they considered beneath them, to look Adrian Stone in the eye and speak. Adrian froze. He was used to flattery, to seeing people bend under the weight of his wealth, to the rehearsed deference that followed him everywhere. But never before, not from anyone, let alone a restaurant employee, had someone dared to speak to him so directly. The words echoed in his mind, crashing into every corner of his thoughts. He could feel Malik's gaze still locked onto him, waiting for a reaction. A memory rushed back. His wife, smiling as she held their son, once said that a person's worth couldn't be measured by what they own. That memory stirred something in his chest. The hall sank into a heavy silence. No more laughter, no more ridicule. A few guests cleared their throats in an attempt to break the tension, but even they fell quiet. The cold crept into everyone's posture, making shoulders tighten and backs straighten. They were used to dinners designed to reinforce power, to highlight status. But in this moment, that structure was broken by an ordinary woman. Malik still held Aisha's hand, his eyes glowing with pride. He looked at her, as if he'd found the first ally to stand beside him in a world built on barriers. His smile gave weight to the silence, because it stood in stark contrast to the fury etched across his father's face. The manager stammered, barely finishing a sentence. You'll pay for this insolence! But his voice caught when he realized no one backed him. Not a single person spoke up. Even a few staff members hesitated, their eyes cast downward, unwilling to nod in agreement. The silence wasn't one of indifference. It was the silence of shock. Adrian sat still, eyes distant. He felt as though a familiar layer of armor had just been stripped away. In the past, everything came easy to him. A wave of the hand, a slight smirk, and the world obeyed. But now, in front of so many witnesses, he had no answer. Aisha's words still echoed, forcing him to face a truth he had long ignored. There were things his power could never buy. Guests lowered their eyes. Some looked at Malik, then turned away. Others watched Adrian quietly. No one dared laugh. They feared that even a chuckle now would brand them as fools, clinging to a broken order. In the grandeur of the ballroom, no one noticed the swirling wine or the intricately plated dishes anymore. All were caught in a lopsided confrontation. A billionaire, a disabled boy, a black waitress. And in that stillness, everyone understood they had just witnessed a moment that would change much more than the lives of those three. It would change how power itself was seen by those who once took pride in it. The ballroom remained shrouded in heavy silence after Aisha's words, a silence no one dared to break. The mocking smiles had faded, leaving behind only wary eyes avoiding each other, afraid of becoming the next target of ridicule. At the central table, Adrian Stone sat upright, both hands on the table as if trying to hold himself together, but his eyes had changed. The familiar coldness was no longer pure. It now burned with a sharp intensity, like steel igniting under pressure. He stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, making nearby guests flinch. Each step he took thickened the air. People held their breath, watching Adrian's every move like spectators awaiting a final verdict. He walked straight toward Aisha, his eyes cutting across the room like blades, forcing anyone who met his gaze to look down. Aisha remained still, her hand tightly holding Malik's, her face calm, her eyes never leaving the man approaching. When only a few steps remained between them, his voice rang out, cold and clipped. "Your name?" The question dropped into the silence like a stone, and it seemed the whole room could hear their own heart. Aisha didn't flinch, didn't waver. She drew a deep breath, her eyes steady. Aisha Brown. Her voice rang clear, not a tremor in it. Those three short words echoed through the luxurious hall with the weight of a declaration, of her presence, her right to exist. For the first time since working at Regency Hall, she spoke not to serve, but to assert herself. Adrian stared at her for a moment, his eyes still hard, but something inside him shifted. Her words still rang in his mind. The woman standing before him was unlike thousands of servers he had seen. She was not someone who bowed easily to power. There was a light in her eyes, something unbuyable. Slowly, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a crisp white business card, its corner embossed with the Stone Tower logo. He held it out in front of her, his voice firm. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Stone Tower. Don't be late. The words dropped like a hammer, leaving many stunned. Most assumed it was a dismissal, a final blow, like being fired with a parting command just to humiliate her. Whispers stirred again, people murmuring that this black girl's fate was sealed, that after crossing Adrian Stone, she wouldn't find a place anywhere in the city. But Aisha didn't react the way they expected. She didn't shrink, and her face didn't pale in fear. She took the business card with a hand still slightly trembling from the tension, but her eyes remained calm. A small nod, no extra words, just a quiet acceptance, as if she knew the path ahead might be a trap, or it might open into something else. In that moment, the composure in Aisha's eyes became another shockwave that rippled through the room. Malik stood beside her, wide-eyed, his small hand still holding hers. He didn't fully grasp what had just happened, but he sensed the shift. A flicker of a smile crossed his face, not from joy, but from trust. In Aisha's eyes, he saw a rare pride, the kind he longed to have for himself. She had faced everything and hadn't stepped back. The entire room followed their every move, every breath. Those who had just laughed now stayed silent. Some guests shifted in their seats, wanting to speak but stopping short. The restaurant manager, pale-faced, opened his mouth but said nothing. He knew that anything he said now could be crushed beneath the heel of power. Only Adrian and Aisha remained at the center, close enough for everyone to see the confrontation, but also close enough to feel the blend of respect and challenge hanging between them. Adrian gave Aisha one last look, his face unreadable. He turned and walked back to his seat, each step slow but heavy with presence. When he sat down, the ballroom still hadn't exhaled. No one knew exactly what he meant to do, only that what had just happened was beyond anything they had expected. Aisha bowed her head slightly, slipped the business card into her pocket above the apron, then quietly led Malik back to his table. The boy sat down, his face still flushed with emotion, while Aisha walked toward the hallway, as if her shift had come to an end. She didn't need to say anything else. That moment had already etched her image into everyone's memory. Inside Regency Hall, silence returned once more. But this silence was no longer one of scorn or ridicule. It was the silence of fear, of being swept into something they didn't yet understand, of realizing that some forces exist beyond the control and power they thought they owned. From that moment on, no one dared to laugh again. The next morning, the city buzzed with its usual noise, streets packed with traffic, horns blaring against the glass walls of towering building. Aisha stood in front of Stone Tower, looking up at the massive structure rising like it could pierce the sky. The mirrored glass reflected the brilliant morning sun, sharp and cold, giving the tower a presence that felt both proud and menacing. Beneath her feet, her worn shoes scraped against the polished tiles of the plaza, a sharp contrast to the designer shoes worn by those entering the building non-stop. She steadied her breath, her hand unconsciously touching the still warm business card in her pocket. A simple card, yet it felt like both a challenge and a sentence hanging over her head. Still, Aisha stepped forward, each footfall a reminder that she had stood tall in Regency Hall, and she would not allow herself to tremble again. The automatic doors opened, and a blast of air-conditioned cold stopped her for a moment. The lobby gleamed with white marble floors polished to a mirror's shine, reflecting her small figure. Overhead, intricate crystal chandeliers glared down, as if to deny the presence of anyone who didn't belong to this world of luxury. Workers in tailored suits moved quickly, leather shoes tapping sharply against stone. Their eyes skimmed over Aisha, then dropped away, as if her presence stained the pristine floor. Some frowned, others smirked, but all carried the same message: she didn't belong here. Aisha moved toward the front desk. The secretary behind the deep blue marble counter looked up. A woman in her 30s, hair pinned up, thin-framed glasses, face unreadable. Her eyes scanned Aisha from head to toe, pausing slightly at the scuffed shoes before returning to her screen with a dismissive curl of the lips. "The boss doesn't like people who overstep," she said, voice sharp and clipped like a sentence being handed down. "Your name?" "Aisha Brown. I have an appointment," she answered briefly, keeping her voice steady. The secretary tapped a few keys, then lifted the phone, her voice dropping but still clear enough for Aisha to hear every word. "There's a black woman here. Says her name is Aisha Brown. Claims she has an appointment with him. Yes, I'll send her up." She hung up, looked at Aisha again, this time with colder scrutiny. 18, Executive Office. Don't get lost. Aisha gave a slight nod, feeling the stairs still clinging to her as she walked toward the elevators. The sound of her heels echoed awkwardly in a space built for power, a sharp contrast to the smooth, confident rhythm of the glossy leather shoes around her. Only when the elevator doors closed did Aisha let herself breathe deeper, one hand gripping her bag strap like a lifeline. Each floor number blinking on the screen felt like a racing heart. The 18th floor opened to a hallway lined with reflective glass, mirroring stern faces. She stepped into a vast space where every detail screamed luxury: gleaming wood-paneled wall, thick dark blue carpet, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She was led to a large door engraved with the Stone Tower logo. As it opened, Aisha immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere: cold, still, like walking into a cathedral of power. Adrian Stone sat behind a long, ebony desk, a few stacks of documents neatly arranged before him. He didn't look up right away, his eyes fixed on the pages, as if her presence was nothing more than background noise. Only when Aisha sat down across from him did he slowly lift his gaze. His silver-gray eyes were sharp, scanning, filled with the kind of authority that needed no introduction, no greeting, no courtesy. "Are you educated? Or do you only know how to carry trays?" Adrian asked bluntly, his tone openly disdainful. Aisha paused for a beat, steadying herself. This question wasn't just an insult, it was a test. A strike aimed directly at her foundation. Her years at Regency Hall had trained her to withstand judgment, but this was different. This was the voice that had silenced an entire ballroom, and now it was drilling into her sense of worth, daring her to admit she was small. But Aisha didn't flint. She took a deep breath, locking eyes with Adrian. "I studied special education. I completed my bachelor's degree, even pursued graduate work for a time. But when my sister fell ill, I had to stop and earn money to support my family. I carry trays because I need to survive, not because I lack knowledge." The answer was short, but solid. It wasn't an excuse, it was a statement. Her eyes held the clear light of someone who knew her own worth, regardless of what life had demanded of her. Adrian blinked, momentarily taken aback. His brows tightened, and something shifted in his steely gaze, like the faintest crack in a wall of pride. He had assumed she was just another nameless server, uneducated, forgettable. But her answer shattered that image. A black woman, unafraid to speak directly to him, declaring that carrying trays was only a fraction of her truth, and that knowledge and dignity were her core. For a moment, Adrian felt himself pushed back. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, wasn't used to anyone making him pause. He tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, his gaze narrowing, but now there was something new behind it: curiosity. Aisha sat tall, didn't bow her head, didn't show fear. She knew he was testing her, searching for weakness to exploit. But she also knew that if she backed down now, everything she had done at Regency Hall would be for nothing. So she held her composure, as if she were the one measuring him. The silence stretched. Then Adrian leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. Special education, he repeated, his voice lower, as if testing the weight of the word. For a split second, the image of Malik, smiling through an awkward dance, flashed through his mind. The room settled into stillness, only the ticking of the clock audible, and in that silence, for the first time, Adrian Stone realized he might have misjudged the woman sitting across from him. In an office flooded with light reflected off glass walls, Adrian Stone sat upright, his eyes fixed on Aisha's face, as if trying to find the smallest crack to press into. But when she spoke of her education and the decision to leave it behind to support her family, all that remained in him was a strange kind of silence. A man used to nods and deference, used to others bowing before his wealth, now sat across from a woman small in stature, but unafraid to meet his eyes and speak clearly. He cleared his throat, reached for the thick folder already laid out on the desk, and flipped it open. Each page was neatly arranged, proof that it had been prepared in advance. "I know about Step Forward," he said slowly, voice measured, then pushed the folder toward her. Aisha frowned slightly, her hand hesitating at the edge of the cover. Her eyes skimmed the bold text. The images of children learning to walk with crutches, and a few old newspaper clippings about a small but meaningful community project. Her chest tightened, not because she was surprised he knew, but because she realized how deeply he had dug into a part of her past she had guarded closely. Adrian leaned back, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You started it with your sister, didn't you? I read it all. That center now exists only on paper. It's about to shut down for lack of funding. Am I wrong?" He didn't wait for an answer, certain the file held no errors. His tone dissected the project like a failed investment, stripping bare one of her most private wounds. Aisha said nothing, but her gaze stayed steady. She looked at him with more calm than she thought she had. Inside, the pain of Step Forward had never faded, but it was also her pride, proof that she once dared to believe in something good. If he thought typed words on paper could shake her, he was wrong. Adrian leaned forward, voice sharp as steel. "I'll pay you 10 times what you make at the restaurant, or anywhere else you've scraped by. In return, you do one thing, stay close to Malik. Be a friend, a therapist, whatever it takes to stop that boy from turning my events into a circus." His words landed like a contract slammed down with an iron hammer, leaving no space for negotiation. A long moment passed. Aisha sat still. She could accept. The money could save the center, support her sister, and even help her. But when she saw Malik's image in her mind, the boy beaming in his first awkward dance, she knew the offer didn't come from care. It came from wounded pride. Adrian didn't want her for who she was, but because he couldn't bear that his son had found joy through someone he had looked down on. Aisha lifted her head, eyes so cold they made Adrian flinch. "You want to buy sincerity for your son? I'm not selling." Her voice echoed through the room, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through every pane of glass like a clean blade. Adrian froze for a second. His face shifted quickly, from surprise to anger, then into something harder to define. No one had ever spoken to him like that. In Adrian Stone's world, everything had a price, and anyone could be bought, if he wanted. But this small woman had just broken that rule. He slammed the desk, his chair jolting back, voice gravelly with restrained rage. "Do you know what you just turned down? A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, enough money to lift your family out of every hardship. And you chose cheap pride?" His face flushed red, veins rising on his temple. Aisha didn't blink. "You're wrong. I chose dignity. Malik doesn't need someone paid to pretend to care. He needs someone who truly believes he can walk on his own." The room fell silent. Adrian stared at her, fists clenched, unable to speak right away. No one had ever refused him so directly. No one had ever stood this straight in front of him. The humiliation burned, turning his face red, his breath heavy as he struggled to contain his fury. But beneath the anger, something flickered. The image of Malik's smile, bright and real for the first time in years, flashed through his mind, those small, shaky steps with Aisha by his side. Her words, though infuriating, echoed like a painful reminder of what he had forgotten. Adrian turned away, eyes dodging hers, as if to hide the shift inside him. He didn't know what to say next, only that no meeting had ever left him so furious, so unsettled. Across from him, Aisha sat still, her expression calm, as if refusing him had been the most natural thing in the world. That moment marked a quiet turning point. Adrian Stone, a man used to bending the world to his will, had been challenged and refused by a woman he had underestimated, and whether he liked it or not, he knew he wouldn't be able to push the name Aisha Brown from his mind. The air inside the Stone Tower office stretched so tight it felt suffocating. After Aisha's blunt rejection of the bribe, Adrian remained motionless, hand clenched into a fist, silver-gray eyes burning. No one had ever stopped one of his commands with a cold answer like that. The heavy silence dragged on, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock, each second etching itself into the skin. Aisha slowly stood. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket and pulled out an old business card, its corner slightly bent from being kept too long in her wallet. She placed it on the desk, right between them, her voice steady and clear. "Step forward, Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you truly care, bring your son." Her words weren't sharp or raised, but calm, like an open invitation, and a challenge she knew he wouldn't easily walk away from. Adrian stared at the card on the desk, his gaze darkening. He didn't reach for it right away, as if it were something dirty placed onto the heart of his empire. His lips pressed tight, jaw twitching, fury swelling in his chest like a rising tide. Thoughts rushed through his mind. Throw it away, call security, ban her for life. But somewhere deep inside, another part of him lingered on the name, Step Forward, the small center he had skimmed over more than once in grant proposals. He had dismissed it then, calling it a naive dream not worth a second glance. And now the name was back, spoken by the woman who had dared to challenge his authority. Across the desk, Aisha remained standing, her eyes calm but resolute. She wasn't begging, wasn't pleading. She was offering a different way forward, a door open to both Adrian and Malik. If he chose to turn away, she would lose nothing but a chance she had never expected to begin with. But if he accepted, it would be the start of a path he had never imagined walking. The office door swung open, and heels clicked steadily against the wooden floor. Adrian's secretary appeared, eyes scanning Aisha before shifting to her boss. Her face strained for composure, but the corner of her mouth betrayed a hint of scorn. As Aisha passed her, the woman leaned in and whispered, "You just signed your own death warrant." The words were soft, like wind, but sliced through Aisha's ear like a blade. She didn't turn, didn't respond, just kept walking out of the room without a trace of hesitation. Inside, Adrian finally reached for the card. He turned it over, eyes hard with rage. His fingers clenched tight, the thin paper crushed into a small wad in his palm. The veins on his hand bulged, knuckles pale from the pressure. He gritted his teeth, the taste of humiliation and fury thick in his mouth. How could a lowly server dare to challenge him as if they were equal? The door cracked open, and a soft voice spoke, "Dad." Malik stood in the doorway, his steel braces clicking as he stepped inside. His face was a little pale, but his eyes shone with anticipation. He saw the crumpled paper in his father's hand, then looked up at the tense expression on Adrian's face. Slowly, he approached, his small hands resting on the edge of the desk, and whispered, "I want to try, Dad." The words weren't loud, but in the stillness, they struck like thunder. Adrian looked up, his sharp eyes locking onto his son's clear, unwavering gaze. He wanted to dismiss it, to issue a command like always, but those eyes made him pause. In Malik's eyes, there was no fear, only a burning hope, a trust Adrian hadn't seen since the accident. He felt his hand tremble, the crumpled card falling onto the desk. The sting of humiliation hadn't faded, but it was now overtaken by something unfamiliar, helplessness. For the first time, he realized it wasn't money or power that left him speechless. It was his son. Malik repeated himself, his voice firmer. "I want to try, Dad." His face flushed red, his hand gripping the desk's edge. Adrian stared at him, chest rising and falling, then let out a long breath. He knew he had lost. Not to Aisha, but to the look in his own child's eyes. He bowed his head briefly, then straightened, eyes still stern but voice lower. "Fine, we'll try." In that moment, no one in the office knew how much those words would change. Aisha paused in the hallway, as if sensing the shift inside, and Adrian Stone, for the first time in his life, understood that some challenges can't be refused, especially when they come from the bright, steady eyes of a son he had forgotten to truly hear. The sleek black Bentley turned off the main boulevard, rolling into a quiet street tucked behind high-rises, where the glow of billboards no longer reached. The uneven road, pockmarked with potholes, made the luxury car tremble slightly, a stark contrast to the smooth ride it offered on freshly paved streets. Malik stared out the window, his hands trembling on his crutches. He had never seen this place, a neighborhood almost forgotten, with patchy paint on walls, rust streaks trailing down old tin roofs, and streetlights flickering weakly. Unlike the gleam of Stone Tower or the glamour of high society banquets, everything here felt worn, honest, and unpolished. The car stopped in front of a wide warehouse, its faded red brick walls weathered, its iron door stained with rust. Above it hung a warped wooden sign, tilted and barely legible, the words, "Step Forward," nearly lost in the gray sky. The peeling letters still held enough shape for the careful eye to read their meaning. The sight struck Malik with both surprise and something deeper. He turned to his father, searching his face for some kind of affirmation. Adrian Stone sat behind the wheel, his eyes filled with with disdain. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, lips curling into a smirk. This place should be torn down. His voice was rough, echoing in the car's tight space. To a man used to billion-dollar projects and glass towers glowing like thrones, the scene before him was nothing more than a stain on the portrait of power. He felt ridiculous for even considering this visit to a place where a waitress dared to challenge him to bring his son. He thought of starting the engine, turning back, erasing the whole thing. Malik kept his eyes on the old wooden sign, a strange spark in his gaze. He opened the car door, the soft click tearing through the thick silence. His feet touched the ground, crutches tapped the pavement, the sound echoing in the quiet street. He turned to his father, voice firm but soft, almost like a plea. "Dad, I can go in alone." The words cut into Adrian like a blade. The child who once hid behind him was now stepping forward on his own. Pride was challenged, control slipping. He opened his mouth to shout, but the usual words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched his son's thin, determined back move toward the warehouse door, each step a silent rebellion against the towering figure of his father. Adrian clenched his jaw, pushed open the car door, and stepped out. His leather shoes met the dusty ground with a heavy thud, the sound thick with pride forced downward. He followed, eyes scanning the surroundings, still full of contempt, but his pace slowed as the iron door creaked open. A long groaning sound, and light from inside spilled out, revealing a scene he hadn't expected to see. Inside the wide warehouse, dozens of children with incomplete bodies were present. Some sat in wheelchairs, some used crutches, some wore prosthetic limbs, and all gathered in small groups. The space was old, the ceiling stained, the wooden floor creaking, but the children's eyes sparkled brightly, as if holding the whole sky. A few stopped what they were doing when they saw the two figures enter. One by one, their eyes, without cue or signal, turned toward Adrian. Those eyes weren't filled with the flattery he was used to, nor were they like the disdain of the upper class. These were direct, unfiltered stares, like mirrors exposing bare truths. Each gaze held a question, silent but clear. How would this man face the world they lived in? Adrian wavered. For a moment, he didn't feel like a benefactor or the center of admiration. He felt like an ordinary man, standing under the honest, piercing eyes of children who saw straight through every layer of power he had ever worn. Malik paused, turned to look at his father, a small but confident smile blooming across his face. He didn't need to say anything more. His gaze now joined the others inside. Aisha stepped forward from the far end of the room, her face calm, her voice clear as she greeted, "Welcome to Step Forward." Adrian stood still for a moment. It felt as though he had just crossed into another world, one where everything he once saw as weakness radiated a strength he had never imagined. And he understood, whether he liked it or not, this path had opened, and there was no turning back. The room inside the warehouse echoed with music from an old speaker resting on a chipped wooden table. The rhythm was lively but free, unbound by any fixed structure, like the bodies moving in their own unique ways. Malik stepped in, hands gripping his crutches, eyes sweeping over the bright faces lit with joy. A boy with braces on his legs turned slowly but confidently. A girl in a wheelchair tilted her head to the beat, her curls bouncing with every burst of laughter. In the corner, a child with a prosthetic arm tapped floor, turning the sound into a rhythm for the group around him. Together, they formed a scene full of energy, different but never lacking. Malik stood still, stunned. He had never seen a place where weakness turned into such powerful motion. Adrian followed, his expression tight, gaze guarded. He scanned the room and saw none of the order he was used to, only children moving on their own in what looked like chaos. His lips curled slightly, and he muttered just loud enough for Aisha to hear, "Disorder, no structure." To him, therapy should be managed with schedules, exercises, and expert supervision. But here, it all looked like an unregulated celebration. He felt uncomfortable, as if watching time and effort being wasted. Aisha didn't argue. She tilted her head, smiled faintly, and turned to Malik. Her eyes encouraged him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, as if to say, this was his chance. Malik hesitated, eyes blinking quickly with shyness, but then looked at the other children who smiled without pity, whose eyes sparkled with confidence. One boy on crutches noticed him, smiled, and waved him over. Malik took a deep breath and slowly moved forward, each heavy step clinking against the floor. But he didn't retreat. The music shifted tempo, picking up pace, and the children laughed, each catching the beat in their own way. Malik looked around, then lifted his crutches and stepped forward. He was clumsy, nearly stumbling on the first try, but caught himself just in time. A laugh rang out from the corner, but it wasn't mocking, it was cheering. A girl in a wheelchair clapped along, her eyes glowing as if to say, "Keep going." Malik's heart pounded, sweat beading on his forehead, but a smile began to form. Adrian stood behind, eyes still skeptical. He wanted to rush in, hold his son back, stop this before failure played out in front of everyone. But the look in Malik's eyes made him freeze. It had been so long since he'd seen his son this focused, this eager. not the look of a boy being pushed, but one who had found joy. Adrian clenched his fist, breathing heavy, but he didn't move to stop him anymore. Malik began to move more smoothly, his shoulders swaying slightly, a faint smile spreading as he blended in with his new friends. The children around him called out soft cheers, voices rising as he continued walking. Music and laughter merged, transforming the old room into a vibrant stage. Aisha stepped back, letting Malik manage on his own, not guiding, only watching with trust in her eyes. In that moment, the boy was no longer the center of pity, but part of a lively circle where everyone had the right to move freely. Adrian stood with his arms crossed, still frowning, but his gaze slowly shifted. He saw children in wheelchairs laughing, a boy with a prosthetic arm drumming with more rhythm than any real drummer, and his son beginning to shed the heavy shadow he had carried. He didn't admit it, but something inside him flickered. What he had called chaos was giving Malik something none of the doctors, specialists, or elite therapists had managed to offer: joy in moving forward. In the worn-down warehouse, Malik's tentative steps echoed, not perfect, but enough to mark the beginning of a new journey. Aisha smiled, knowing the boy had passed through his hardest door, and Adrian Stone, for the first time in years, was forced to watch his son find strength in a place he had never believed in. And that room, with its disordered music and shared laughter, planted in him the first seed of change he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Aisha stood quietly to the side, her eyes calmly scanning the room. When Adrian muttered his judgment about disorder, she turned slightly, her voice gentle but firm enough to stop him. There is structure, just not the kind you're used to. It wasn't said to argue, but to remind him that order doesn't always come from rigid system. In this old room, every child was finding their own way to move, their own rhythm, and it was that difference that formed the real structure. Adrian narrowed his eyes, tension still visible, but deep inside, he began to sense something slipping beyond what he thought he understood. Malik heard Aisha's word. He looked up, as if finding a new kind of belief. Until now, he had only known how to follow prescribed standards under the strict supervision of doctors and experts. But here, no one forced him to follow a single beat. He looked around, saw a boy on crutches dancing slower to match his body, saw a girl in a wheelchair spinning in her own rhythm, saw another boy drumming with his hands against a chair and filling the room with energy. Malik bit his lip, then lifted his foot, trying to step in time with the music. At first, his body was still clumsy, each step on the verge of stumbling, but there were no pitying eyes on him. The other children clapped and cheered him on. Aisha kept her distance, offering no guidance, only nodding in quiet encouragement. Malik took a deep breath, relaxed his shoulders, and suddenly found his rhythm. His legs still wore steel braces, but he adjusted his movement so that every step became part of the music. The metallic sound hitting the wooden floor no longer felt harsh. It blended into the beat flowing from the old speaker. A faint smile appeared on his lips, different from the forced ones he used to wear during heavy therapy sessions. For the first time, Malik felt that his steps meant something. Not to prove anything to doctors or please his father, but to feel joy for himself. The rhythm in his mind didn't match anyone else's, but it was his own. Aisha watched, seeing his face light up, his eyes sparkling, and she knew a pivotal moment had arrived. Adrian stood behind, eyes locked on his son. He was used to seeing Malik through pity or frustration, but now, he saw something entirely different. The child he believed had broken after the accident was now smiling, drawing strength from legs still bound in braces. His face shifted slightly, hand clenched, then loosened, as if he couldn't believe the scene in front of him. Aisha's words echoed in his mind. There is structure, just not the kind you're used to. Malik kept moving, more fluidly, more confidently. Cheers erupted around the room, and the children formed a circle, clapping in rhythm with him. His smile widened, so bright it seemed to light up the entire space. Adrian stood in awe, his heart stirred by an unfamiliar emotion. He wanted to deny it, to call it a passing moment, but his son's eyes told the truth. Malik had found his own rhythm, something no expensive therapy or strict regimen had ever given him. And in that instant, Adrian realized that the world he once ruled with wealth and control had just been challenged by the proud, unsteady steps of his own son. The room echoed with steady music, simple rhythms carrying a powerful drive. Malik stood in the middle of his new circle of friends, sweat dotting his forehead, his face glowing with each step he had just learned to trust. He glanced down at his leg, eyes flashing with fierce determination. His small hand gripped the edge of his brace. Then he paused, exhaled deeply. In that moment, everything seemed to slow. Every child around him fell silent, and the music softened into a distant hum. Malik reached down and unlatched the brace, the metal clicking sharply as it released, and the right leg brace dropped heavily onto the wooden floor. That sound struck straight into the heart of everyone present. Adrian, standing behind, paled. He saw his son do something forbidden, something far beyond the strict rehabilitation plan. The sight of the boy standing barefoot on one side, eyes steady, made Adrian feel breathless. He wanted to rush forward, grab his son, and bring him back to safety. "Malik!" he called out, deep and hoarse, heavy like a plea. His foot moved, but a hand stopped him. Aisha stepped forward, eyes lit with trust, her voice firm and clear across the room. "Let him lead." Adrian froze, his gaze locking with Aisha's calm but unwavering stare. He had never seen anyone stand between him and his son with such pride. Her words echoed in his head, cutting through the fear and frustration. He looked at Malik again, and in his son's eyes there was no pleading, only resolve. The boy had made his own choice. Malik lifted the foot now free of the brace, knees trembling under the weight, his whole body tense as if about to fall. The room was silent, every child watching with wide eyes, breath held. He inhaled deeply, clenched his jaw, and set his foot down. A sharp thud rang out, dry but resonant. The first step was shaky, shoulders quivering, hands grabbing at the air for balance. But instead of collapsing, he steadied himself, body swaying, then straightening again. A smile broke across his face, hesitant but glowing. A girl in a wheelchair let out a soft cheer. A clap followed like the first beat of a drum, then the whole room joined in. Malik heard it, heart pounding, but that beat became fuel. He raised his foot again, took another step. This time, there was no metal sound, only the bare skin meeting the wood. Simple, but powerful. The pain was still there, the struggle still present, but the joy that surged within him drowned it all out. Adrian looked at his son, his heart jolting violently. He had once believed that only experts and standardized therapies could help Malik recover, but this scene proved the opposite. Malik didn't need to be controlled, he needed to lead himself. Adrian felt a sting behind his eyes, his hand dropping loosely at his side, no longer trying to hold anything back. Malik kept moving, his steps short but full of courage. Cheers echoed across the room, children clapping, laughter rippling through the air. In that warm chaos, Adrian felt his heavy heart lift, a layer of ice long frozen inside him finally cracking. Aisha stood nearby, her eyes following Malik, a gentle smile blooming with quiet triumph. In that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't just an ordinary step, but the first free step of a boy who once thought he'd never walk again. Malik pushed down with all his strength on his bare foot, his body wobbling like he might fall, steadied again and again. A deep breath burst from his small chest, and the second step came, slow, firm. When his foot hit the wooden floor, the sound that followed was no longer the harsh scrape of metal, but a collective exhale from the entire room. Malik had just taken a full step, not with help or pressure, but of his own will. The room erupted. Applause thundered, and cheers broke from children and adults alike. Some cried. A kid in a wheelchair pounded his cushion like a drum. Every soul joined in the joy. Malik stood in the center of it all, his face flushed, his glowing smile lighting up his eyes brighter than ever. In that roar of sound, a flash of light sparked from the corner of the room. The shutter of a camera clicked, faint at first, then in rapid succession. A young reporter, originally there to cover a story on a community event, had lifted her camera just in time to capture the rare moment. The flashes caught Malik, his radiant smile, the instant he took his first complete step. Soon, more cameras came out, from journalists, volunteers, even a few parents. Each flash was like a stamp carved into the history of the worn-out room, turning it into an accidental stage. Adrian Stone stood in the back, his face darkening as the lenses turned toward his son. He had always controlled the family's image, carefully orchestrating every public appearance. But now, everything was slipping beyond his grasp. A part of him felt his pride threatened, and another part was awakening at the sight before him. Malik, the son he once tried to shield in silence, was now being celebrated by the entire room. Adrian raised his hand, ready to stop it, but halted midway when he saw the fearless smile shining on his son's face under the blinding flashes. That smile no longer belonged to a child bound by limits. It was the smile of someone who had just proven his own strength. The photos spread quickly. One reporter immediately sent the image to her newsroom, while others shared it on social media. Within minutes, the picture of Malik walking through cheers had appeared on the phone screens of people miles away. That wave of sharing couldn't be stopped, slipping through headlines and breaking past the walls of the small room to reach the larger world. The glances, the whispers, and the applause that had just filled that confined space had now transformed into a tidal surge across media platforms. Malik didn't know any of this. He was still smiling with joy, listening to his friends cheering. Aisha stood beside him, her eyes shimmering with pride, her hand gently resting on his shoulder like a silent congratulations. Adrian stood still, his eyes locked on his son, his chest stirring with a swirl of emotions, concern, astonishment, and an undeniable truth. His son had just shattered a limit. And in the flashes of those cameras, that step was no longer just a personal milestone. It had become a symbol of belief, spreading faster than anything Adrian had ever managed to control. The cheers in the room hadn't yet faded when a new wave surged forward, Not from the children, but from behind the camera lenses. Flashes burst repeatedly, and hurried footsteps echoed as reporters pushed in. They had come expecting a typical community event, but the scene unfolding had exceeded every expectation. One man raised a recorder, charging straight toward Adrian Stone, voice loud and clear. "You once rejected Step Forward, didn't you?" The question cut through the room, turning every gaze toward him. Adrian froze. For a moment, all the reflexes that had once secured him victories in the business world vanished. His mouth stayed shut, his tongue heavy, unable to form a reply. The question hit like an arrow piercing through layers of pride, exposing cracks he had long hidden behind polished facade. More reporters crowded in, microphones and recorders pushed forward, voices sharp and rapid. "How many times did you reject it? What do you feel seeing your son walk here? Do you think you were wrong?" The questions exploded into a storm, backing Adrian into a corner with no way out. He turned, eyes instinctively searching for something to anchor him. Then he saw Malik. The boy still stood inside the circle of friends, cheeks flushed, smile unbroken. His son was neither blinded by the flashes nor shaken by the crowd. Malik looked at him, eyes shining with trust and an unspoken question. "Dad, do you see me now?" That look clenched Adrian's chest. All these years, he had tried to hide Malik from the public, as if covering up a flaw. Now his son stood tall on his own strength, while he fumbled like a man whose mask had just been torn away. The crowd waited for a response, the room shrinking, air thick with pressure. Adrian pressed his lips together, the veins at his temples pulsing. He knew whatever he said would be recorded, dissected, judged, but silence would mean admission. Aisha stood nearby, silent, her eyes on Malik, as if to remind him the focus wasn't on him, but on the child who had just proved something extraordinary. Adrian drew a deep breath, but his throat tightened, and his eyes never left his son. In that moment, Adrian realized the real cost wasn't admitting failure to the press. It was having denied Malik for so long. His son didn't need a powerful father to protect his image. He needed one willing to face the truth. Adrian said nothing, but the silence, the way he looked at Malik, was enough for those watching to sense the battle raging within. And in the storm of lenses, for the first time, Adrian Stone felt how small his power truly was. The storm of questions kept crashing down. A swarm of microphones and recorders pointed at Adrian like hundreds of invisible spears. The flashes continued to fire, making the already cramped room feel even more suffocating. Adrian stood still, his hand slightly trembling, eyes fixed on his son as if searching for one final anchor. Malik looked at him, his face flushed from the steps he had just taken, but his eyes shone bright, full of pride. In that moment, a memory of his late wife came rushing back to Adrian. She had once said that some lessons couldn't be bought, only learned through courage. Surrounded on all sides, he knew that if he stayed silent any longer, the world would see him as selfish and cold. He took a deep breath, chest rising, and spoke with a resounding voice. "Yes, I rejected Step Forward 3 times. I was wrong." The room froze for a beat. No one had expected him to admit it so directly. Flashes exploded even more intensely, and murmurs erupted everywhere. But Adrian didn't stop. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice dropping lower, each word carving into the air. "Starting today, the Montgomery Fund will cover all expenses for Step Forward, not just for a year, permanently, enough for it to grow into a full rehabilitation and research center." The declaration struck like thunder, silencing the crowd for a moment before it erupted into noise. Malik's eyes widened, his lips trembling before a beaming smile burst across his face. Children cheered, their parents cried, while Aisha stood still, eyes bright but cautious. Adrian turned to her, his face still firm, and over the clamor of reporters, he stated clearly, "There's one condition." The room fell quiet again, cameras raised in anticipation. Adrian lowered his voice slightly, but remained crystal clear. "Aisha Brown will have full authority over methodology. My fund won't interfere with how Step Forward is run. I provide the resources, but the approach, philosophy, and execution belong to her." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was pure astonishment. A man who had built an empire on absolute control was now publicly handing power to a black woman who had once been a restaurant server. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some exchanged glances, aware they were witnessing a rare turning point, not just for a small community program, but for one of the city's most powerful figures. Aisha nodded slowly, her gaze meeting Adrian's, not revealing any overjoyed expression, just a calm steadiness, as if she had been preparing for this moment all along. Pride welled quietly inside her, not for herself, but because the children would be protected, and the methods she and her sister had painstakingly developed wouldn't become a corporate showpiece. Adrian stood tall as the flashbulbs continued to fire, but this time, he didn't feel cornered. He knew this decision would enrage many in the financial world, but he also knew that if he walked away now, he would lose something far more valuable than wealth. The room burst into cheers. Malik ran into his father's arm, tears spilling down his young face. Adrian held him tightly, feeling something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Surrounded by cameras, he no longer cared what tomorrow's headlines would say. He only knew he had admitted his failure and handed power to the right hand. And in the dazzling chaos of flash after flash, a new beginning had taken shape. News of Adrian Stone's unexpected announcement spread faster than he had imagined. By the next morning, headlines flooded the media, plastered with photos of him standing beside Malik and Aisha, along with his pledge to fund Step Forward indefinitely. While the outside audience responded with surprise and, for the most part, support, the reaction inside Stone Tower was entirely different. An emergency meeting was called, the boardroom glittering with chandelier light yet thick with tension. Dozens of major shareholders sat in a circle, every face tense, eyes drilling into Adrian as if trying to strip him bare. The first voice rose, high and furious. "You got played by a black waitress." The words rang out without restraint, shaking the room. Nods of agreement followed, each person eager to unload their outrage. Adrian sat at the head of the table, his chair upright, hands clasped, forehead etched with creases. He was no stranger to confrontation, but he had never seen his own ranks erupt with such fury. Accusations poured in. Some claimed he was sabotaging the company's image. Others condemned him for letting emotions interfere with a brand built on cold calculation. Every word landed like a knife, carving into the crumbling image of his once untouchable authority. In that moment, he felt caught between two worlds. On one side was the business legacy he had spent decades building, rooted in absolute control and unforgiving logic. On the other hand, was the heart of a father who had just witnessed his son walk on his own, something millions of dollars poured into luxury rehab centers had never achieved. The tension pulled at every muscle in his face, and deep in his eyes was the unmistakable turmoil of a man torn in two. The shareholders kept hammering away, throwing numbers at him. They listed potential stock drops, profit losses, and the risk that the public would see him as weak. They warned that the financial world would regard him as a senile man, funding the fantasy of an unknown woman instead of safeguarding an empire. One man even shot up from his seat and slammed the table. "We invested in Stone Tower because of your ruthlessness, not so you could play charity games." The echo of his hand on the table rippled through the room, which was used to quiet calculated deals. Adrian listened to it all, but in his mind, Malik's faltering steps kept replaying. That beaming smile under the camera flashes, Aisha's calm voice affirming the power of dignity. His fists clenched, half of him ready to explode, to roar and restore order, but the other half stayed silent, reminding him that not all battles are measured in profit. In that moment, he realized the greatest fight of his life wasn't against competitors. It was within himself, between the proud ego of a billionaire and the late-blooming love of a father. No one in the boardroom knew what he would choose, but everyone could see the visible struggle on his face. The shareholders waited for an answer, the press outside waited for a move, and Malik, somewhere else, was surely waiting for a father willing to stand by him. Adrian knew that every choice came with a price, and this time, it was a price that couldn't be paid with money. After the tense board meeting, Adrian returned to his private office, carrying a restlessness he had never felt before. All afternoon, he sat alone, answering no calls, reading no financial reports, faced only with the stack of documents his assistant had left on his desk that morning. They were studies on the brain, on neuroplasticity, and the adaptive abilities of children with disabilities. He had planned to dismiss them, to treat them as useless academic reports. But Aisha's words kept echoing in his mind, that Malik needed to be guided, not controlled. His hand instinctively opened the folder, his eyes scanning each page, at first just to find a reasonable explanation to give the shareholders, to prove that his decision wasn't driven by emotion, but grounded in scientific rationale. The dense lines of text irritated him at first, but then certain quotes and charts began to hold his gaze. The studies on brain flexibility revealed that children, even those with physical injuries, could develop new neural pathways when encouraged to take initiative in movement. The more he read, the more it felt like someone was describing the exact moment he had witnessed the day before. Malik walking with legs no longer bound by braces. He told himself he was only looking for evidence to persuade the board, but the slow, steady beat of his heart betrayed him, revealing a deeper shift. Adrian scribbled notes in the margins, underlining phrases like motor autonomy, emotional engagement, and neural reconnection. Words that once seemed like distant academic jargon now felt like keys unlocking the reason behind Malik's radiant smile with every step. He continued reading a report comparing rigid therapy methods with those allowing children to find their own rhythm. The results showed that those encouraged to choose their own pace recovered twice as fast and showed greater emotional resilience. Adrian put the pen down, closed his eyes, and felt as if an entirely new world had just begun to open. Late at night, the office was lit only by the dim glow of a desk lamp. He left behind stacks of unsigned contracts, pushed aside the quarterly profit projections, and continued reading the materials Aisha had once mentioned. With each page, he saw the patience of those who believed in the value of difference, and more importantly, he saw glimpses of his own son in every example, every experiment. Each line became a reminder that there was a path beyond the rigid framework he had long pursued. At first, Adrian thought he was just defending himself, looking for a shield to counter an angry board, but the deeper he delved into the research, the less it was about justification. He began to believe, not because he needed to prove a point, but because yearned for an approach that would allow Malik to truly live. That belief didn't arrive with noise or urgency, but crept in quietly, slowly filling every thought, every breath. For the first time in years, he was reading not for a deal, but for hope, for his son. When he closed the folder, the look in his eyes was no longer clouded. Adrian understood that the power struggle within the board was far from over, but deep down, he had already chosen a side. It wasn't the shareholders' side, nor entirely Aisha's. It was Malik's, the side of those free steps, waiting to be led by the boy himself. And he knew his life had just turned onto a path from which there was no return. That afternoon, the atmosphere at Step Forward was livelier than usual. The children were fully engaged in their exercises. Music from the old speaker echoed through the room, blending with laughter and the rhythmic clack of crutches on the wooden floor. Malik had grown more comfortable with the group, his face glowing with excitement as he joined the movements. Aisha stood quietly in the corner, pride in her eyes, as she watched every step. But the peace was quickly broken when the metal door creaked open, its prolonged screech like a bad omen. A group of uniformed officers stepped in, exuding authority, their heavy footsteps dragging the entire room into silence. The laughter vanished, and some children froze mid-movement, their wide eyes fixed on the door. Leading the group was a tall officer whose eyes gleamed with disdain as he slowly scanned each young face. He let out a bitter laugh, his voice cutting across the room. "You'll be crawling like that your whole life." The words sliced through the air like a cold blade, leaving a weight that sank into every chest. A few children lowered their head, hands trembling, and some instinctively reached for their leg braces, as if to hide them. Malik froze, the smile on his face fading instantly, his gaze flickering between anger and hurt. The room, once filled with sound, now felt hollow, heavy with tension. Another officer gave a dry chuckle, glanced at Malik and sneered, "This is Stone's son, isn't it? How sad. All that money, and it buys you nothing but a few shaky steps." The comment darkened Adrian's face. He was used to contempt from business rivals, but hearing it aimed at his son made his blood boil. He clenched his fists, ready to speak, but Aisha stepped forward first. She positioned herself between the children and the officers, her voice clear, firm, and defiant. "You may carry guns, carry power, but you have no right to strip these kids of their belief. Here, they are not weak, they are warriors learning to stand on their own feet." Her words bounced off the brick walls, echoing through the space, powerful enough to make a few parents in the back lift their head, their eyes lighting up. The officers hesitated, surprised, but still smirked. One of them shook his head and muttered, "You really think a few half-baked dance moves will change their lives?" The words hadn't fully settled before Adrian stepped forward, his tall figure imposing, his voice low but commanding. "You'd better be careful with what you just said, because a single step can be enough for a child to stand against the whole world, and I will be the first to defend that." The room fell silent, children's eyes wide, while the officers paused, momentarily stunned by the unwavering challenge in front of them. In that moment, the contempt behind the uniforms no longer had the power to suffocate the room. The children began to lift their heads, some clapping in time with the music, as if to prove they would not be broken by cruel words. Malik looked at his father, eyes lighting up once more, and he knew that for the first time, his father was no longer standing outside the fight, but beside him. In the step-forward room, the confrontation wasn't just between power and vulnerability. It was proof that the arrogance of uniforms could not extinguish the strength born of belief and courage. Aisha stepped forward, her face stripped of its usual gentleness, now steeled to the point where even the children behind her held their breath. She spread her arms wide, blocking the way like a living shield, eyes locked on the sneering officer. Her voice rang out, echoing off the old brick walls. "You have guns, we have rhythm, and this rhythm isn't afraid of you." The words came out crisp, deliberate, both a challenge and a declaration, igniting a new charge in the already tense air. The murmurs from the parents at the back of the room faded, replaced by complete silence, as every eye turned to the unprecedented standoff. The officers paused, their faces still mocking, but with a flicker of surprise in their eyes. They were used to subduing with intimidation, forcing others to bow, but the woman before them didn't didn't back down. One of them curled his lip in a smirk and stepped forward half a pace, eyes full of provocation. In that charged moment, some children gripped their crutches tighter. Others clung to their friend's shoulders, their eyes a mix of fear and admiration. Aisha's stance in the center of the room suddenly became the kind of anchor these kids had never known. At that moment, the door burst open, leather shoes striking the floor like a war drum announcing the arrival of authority. Adrian stepped in, his face stone cold, his gaze as sharp as a blade cutting straight toward the officers. He didn't need to speak right away. His presence alone was enough to hush the room. The children turned in unison, surprised to see him at the threshold, his tall frame casting a shadow across the wooden floor. A heavy silence stretched out, as if everyone was waiting to see which side he would choose. Adrian strode forward, his steps firm, the floor creaking beneath each one. He stopped just behind Aisha, eyes fixed on the uniforms before him. Without raising his voice, he spoke low, each word distinct. "That's enough." The short statement hit like a strike, shaking the air. The coldness in his tone wasn't the shouting of someone trying to assert control. It was the authority of a man who no longer tolerated insult. The officers instinctively reached toward their belts, but Adrian's stare alone made them falter. The whole class watched, wide-eyed with surprise and anticipation. They saw a man who once symbolized a distant world now standing in the middle of their worn-out room, not to give orders, but to stand up for them. Malik sat nearby, his heart pounding, feeling closer to his father than ever before. He didn't need an explanation. Just seeing his father standing tall, coldly facing down those who had mocked them, was enough to make him believe something was changing. The officers looked briefly unsettled, their mocking laughter gone, replaced by an awkward silence. Outside, music from the old speaker kept playing, steady like a heartbeat, like an answer to Aisha's words. In that moment, power didn't come from weapons or authority, but from the unity of the room, from the sight of a father and an ordinary woman standing against condescension. And for every child present, that moment became proof that sometimes it only takes one person to stand up for the world to begin to shift. The news exploded overnight. All major newspapers ran bold front-page headlines. Billionaire stands up to police to protect disabled children. The image of Adrian standing beside Aisha in the old room, with dozens of children looking up from behind, became a symbol across social media. Articles featuring photos of Malik smiling brightly in the arms of his friends moved the public deeply. Thousands of comments praising the transformation of a man once known for his coldness. In the eyes of the public, Adrian was no longer just a notorious businessman, but a father who placed love above pride. Aisha, too, was honored with glowing titles. Some called her the one who lit the fire. Others said she was the heart of Step Forward. Yet while a wave of support spread outside, those who had lost power began to strike back. On the evening after the articles were published, Step Forward stayed open as usual. The children lingered longer in practice. Aisha and a few parents stayed late to clean up. The room remained lit, music still echoing faintly, and everyone believed a new chapter was beginning. But once all had gone home, and darkness swallowed the empty street, a group of strangers appeared. They said nothing, carrying iron rods, red paint cans, and small jugs of gasoline. In minutes, the old brick walls were smashed, posters for the children ripped down, and the wooden floor shattered into splinters. A metal door was pried open, window glass shattered, glittering under the moonlight. The next morning, when Aisha returned, chaos greeted her. The old speaker lay in pieces, chairs and tables collapsed, red paint smeared across the walls, the most jarring being a scrawled phrase, "Stay in your place." Aisha stood frozen, fists clenched, throat tight. Parents with her began to cry, and children stared wide-eyed at the wreckage. Malik quietly stepped forward, placing his hand on the red smear. His hand trembled, but his eyes blazed like fire. When Adrian arrived at the scene, he stood amid the destruction, his eyes darkening. Memories of boardroom accusation, the contemptuous glances from the police days earlier, all surged back as proof that he had touched a nerve among those clinging to the old order. He realized this was no longer a matter of words. It had become a true battle, with an underground tide surfacing. But as he saw Malik standing tall among the ruins, not crying, but lifting his chin with quiet defiance, he knew he could never turn away. The entire city quickly learned that the center had been vandalized. Waves of reporters flooded in, camera flashes going off non-stop. Several newspapers condemned the act as a cowardly attempt to intimidate vulnerable children, while TV channels repeatedly aired images of Aisha standing amid the wreckage, declaring that classes would continue no matter how hard things got. The incident sparked even greater public sympathy. Numerous NGOs and individuals reached out, promising support. Yet alongside this surge of encouragement came a rise in warning. Adrian realized this was no longer just about a small rehabilitation center. He was now facing forces that didn't want Step Forward to exist, because its very existence was a direct indictment of old prejudices and entrenched power. But this time, he wasn't acting to protect his image. He was doing it for Malik, for his son's smile, and for the courageous eyes of children who had always been overlooked. He knew the cost would be high, but he also understood that change only begins when someone dares to confront the darkness. And in that moment, surrounded by shattered walls, he knew he had chosen a path with no way back. As evening approached, Step Forward remained busy. The reporters had left, and only parents and a few volunteers stayed behind to clean up what remained. Malik sat on the steps, his small hands stained with red paint, his eyes heavy. He had seen the center destroyed, had watched the adults try to hide their worry behind strained smiles, but his young heart still felt the unease hanging in the air. When Adrian emerged from the damaged room, his shirt dusty, his once polished shoes scuffed, Malik looked up at him, his voice timid, catching in his throat. "Did I make you lose all your friends?" The question struck like a blade, cutting through the last of the noise. Adrian paused, looking at the sun, waiting for an answer. To Malik, friends meant the people who used to toast with his father at parties, who clapped him on the back after every business victory, those who now distanced themselves because he had chosen to stand with the children no one else would. Adrian sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of a child still trembling. He exhaled slowly, his eyes tired, firm. "You just gave me real friends." His voice was low but steady, each word like a vow. Malik's eyes widened, not fully understanding, but his heart began to lift. Adrian pulled him close, arms strong yet gentle, not as a shield for a weak child, but as the embrace of a man recognizing the strength in his own son. In that embrace, he realized the friends he once had were never truly there to lean on. They came for profit, prestige, and the glow he projected. But the moment he chose a different path, they vanished quicker than a handshake. What Malik had just witnessed didn't shake Adrian, but instead made things clearer. He had once believed power could sustain all relationships. But in this moment, holding his small son in his arms, he understood that love and truth were the foundation for finding people who would truly stay. The parents nearby grew quiet, watching the father and son embrace amid the rubble, many eyes brimming with tears. No explanation was needed. They knew the center now had a stronger foundation than any form of funding. Malik pressed his head into his father's chest, the smell of plaster dust and sweat mixing together. But to him, it was the scent of safety. He whispered again, voice trembling. "So, they'll come to us, right?" Adrian gave a slight nod, his eyes lit with determination. "Those who truly want change will come. And when they do, you'll see that friends aren't the ones sitting at banquet tables, but the ones who choose to stand with you in the hardest times." In the sky above, the late afternoon light shone down on the cracked, "Step Forward" sign. But beneath the layer of dust, the letters were still clear. For Malik, it was a sign the journey wasn't over. For Adrian, it was a reminder that losing old friends was simply the cost of discovering new allies. Ones who would stay not for the name Stone or the wealth behind it, but for purpose, for belief. And with his arms wrapped around his son, he knew he had made the right choice. In the days that followed, Step Forward came back to life after the upheaval. The rubble was cleared, and the patchy walls were repainted with bright colors chosen by the children themselves. Malik returned to class with eyes more radiant than ever, and during the first session after the center reopened, he reached down and removed another brace. The room fell silent, everyone watching with bated breath. He took a deep breath, sweat rolling down his temple, and set his fragile foot on the floor. The sound of contact rang out clearly, and this time, his body didn't sway as before, but held balance more steadily. One step, then another. He stood on legs that bore less weight, his face glowing. The room erupted, applause bursting forth. Aisha stood nearby, offering no support, only a slight nod, as if to signal that he was on the right path. Adrian watched the scene, and in his eyes, there was no longer just concern, but a spark of wonder and a growing sense of belief. Malik progressed so rapidly that many could hardly believe it. The boy, once diagnosed to rely on braces for life, was now moving on nearly bare legs. He focused intensely, Each visit to the center became a new personal challenge, but instead of faltering, he embraced it with joy. Each step was no longer just a medical feat. It became proof of willpower. His smile spread to those around him, filling the class with vibrant energy. The other children, who were used to pitiful glances from society, suddenly found a role model in their own peer. It wasn't just Malik. Other children began to surpass what medical expectations had set. A girl in a wheelchair, after months of training, learned to spin with astonishing grace, turning what was once a burden into an extension of her dance. A boy with a prosthetic arm practiced tapping rhythms on the wooden floor until it formed its own melody, which the whole class followed and turned into a group routine. Each child had their own limits, yet all were slowly breaking them, discovering a new language for their bodies. The worn-out room had become a stage for rebirth, where the concept of disability was blurred by faith and effort. Aisha watched it all, her eyes filled with pride. To her, what was happening wasn't just the result of exercises. It was proof that Step Forward's method was right. She didn't impose rigid templates or force the children into stiff clinical motion. She created a space for them to find their own rhythm. That freedom turned weakness into strength, clumsiness into identity. Adrian began to see this too. At first, sitting quietly just to supervise, but gradually becoming a silent student. Many parents were stunned to see how their children had changed. They had once felt hopeless after a string of cold diagnoses, but now they saw their children smile, saw progress no doctor had ever dared to promise. They began to get more involved, helping clean the center, pitching in to buy equipment, and even quitting jobs to volunteer. That connection transformed Step Forward from a mere training facility into a community, a shared home. For Adrian, each visit was an internal challenge. He faced judgmental eyes from the media and pressure from investors, but when he saw his son blending in with his peers, he knew his choice mattered. He began reading more medical studies, not to refute them, but to truly understand. The more he read, the more he realized Malik's progress wasn't random. It was the outcome of a philosophy built on fostering autonomy. His gaze slowly filled with respect for Aisha, who had stood by this method even when it was dismissed. The Step Forward room was still old, its walls still cracked, but inside, day by day, the children were writing a new story. Malik walked more lightly, and his peers kept defying medical prediction. Adrian sat there, silent, but his heart swelled with pride. Amid the chaos of the outside world, he understood that the real lessons didn't come from lavish banquets or gleaming boardroom, but from his son's unsteady footsteps and those of his friends, the children who had taught him the power of faith and courage. Adrian sat in a corner of the room, his eyes following Malik's every move. In the past, whenever his son practiced, he stood close by, ready to command, correct, and sometimes shout to force Malik into precise movements. But the space at Step Forward confused him. No one here demanded the kids move in sync. No one imposed a rigid sequence. Each child moved in their own way, had their own rhythm, all flowing together with the music from an old speaker, forming a strange harmony. Adrian initially saw it as chaos, but the more he watched, the more he saw an invisible order within that freedom. Malik was laughing, his face shining as if pain had never existed, and Adrian stayed still, no interruptions, no commands. Gradually, Adrian learned to step back and let Malik find his own way. He restrained the hand that always wanted to intervene, patiently watched clumsiness turn into confidence. In the beginning, his heart raced every time Malik wobbled, but then Aisha would gently shake her head and smile, as if to say falling was part of the journey. Adrian began to understand. Sometimes love isn't about protecting at all costs, but about daring to trust your child to walk alone. He felt smaller, but also lighter, no longer needing to play the role of total control. That change didn't only happen during practice. At home, Adrian also learned to listen to his son more. In the past, every conversation was a command followed by short, dry replies. Now, he let Malik talk about his friends, about the exercises, about the small joy of mastering a new move. He didn't interrupt, just listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes nodding gently. For a man who had spent his life giving orders and staying in control, learning to step back turned out to be harder than any business deal. But it gave him something he had never had, a real connection. Aisha observed this change from a distance. She didn't say much, just continued her work, though her eyes occasionally held a trace of satisfaction. She knew it wasn't easy for someone like Adrian to take a step back, let alone trust a method he once mocked. But day by day, he stopped being the shadow looming over Malik and became a quiet source of support. Sometimes, Aisha caught the way he looked at his son, and in that gaze, there was no more doubt, only quiet belief. One evening, after class had ended and the room was dimly lit by a fading yellow light, the children had all gone home, and Malik was chatting with a few friends in the hallway. Adrian walked toward Aisha, his face no longer tense but thoughtful. He stood still for a long moment, as if searching for the right word. Finally, in a low, measured voice, he said, "You taught me how to follow." The sentence was short, but every word carried the weight of acknowledgement. Aisha looked surprised at first, her eyes widening before softening. She didn't reply right away, just nodded slightly, as if accepting the gratitude without embellishment. For Adrian, that admission was harder than any contract he had ever signed. His whole life had been about leading, imposing, forcing everything to revolve around him, and now he was learning how to stand back and let his son find his own way. The moment he spoke those words was also the moment he let go of the pride that had shielded him for too long. From a distance, Malik saw his father talking with Aisha. He couldn't hear what was being said, but the softness in his father's eyes made him feel safe. He knew something had truly changed. Step forward wasn't just where he learned to walk, it was where his father learned to step back, so that love was no longer pressure, but presence. In the small room, beneath the cracks that hadn't yet been patched, the silence between the two adults marked something significant. Adrian, once a man used to holding power, had learned a quiet but profound lesson. Sometimes, to love, you have to make space for someone else to rise. And in that silent admission, he didn't feel loss, but for the first time felt free, just like his son discovering his own rhythm. After many months of recovery and rebuilding, Step Forward was completely transformed. The old, cracked warehouse was replaced by a bright new building, its walls painted in vibrant colors chosen by the children themselves. Some liked ocean blue, others wanted touches of sunshine yellow, and all were blended beautifully. The walls were lined with paintings the children had created, showing footsteps, wheelchair wheels turned into spinning propellers, prosthetic arms held tightly in dance. The spacious practice room was filled with mirrors, reflecting warm light, and the wooden floor was firmly installed, so each crutch step no longer echoed sharply, but rang out like steady drums keeping rhythm. The back garden was redesigned into a restful space, full of flowers cared for by parents and volunteers, where each afternoon the children could sit and talk beneath the trees. This was no longer just a therapy center, but a home built from the ideas, dreams, and hands of children once seen as incapable of making choices for themselves. The inauguration day unfolded with unprecedented joy. From early morning, the once quiet street buzzed with laughter and chatter. Families with disabilities came from across the city, holding hands as they stepped through the newly painted gate marked with bold letters, "Step Forward." Excitement filled the air. Children dressed neatly, many in wheelchairs, others on crutches, but all with radiant faces. Parents stood nearby, fingers interlaced, as if they had finally found a true community, one where they no longer had to lower their gaze under looks of pity. A small stage had been set up in the courtyard, covered in plain white fabric, with welcome banners hung behind. In the rows of seats, Malik sat beside his father, his eyes bright as he watched his friends giggle and prepare for the opening performance. Adrian sat quietly. He had never attended an event where he wasn't the main figure, but this time he accepted sitting among the others. His heart was heavy, but also relieved, because he knew today wasn't about celebrating him, it was about honoring the resilience of the children. When the ceremony began, Aisha stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple dress, her face calm and composed. Her voice rang out clearly, needing no microphone to quiet the courtyard. "Today, we're not only inaugurating a new building, we are inaugurating a new belief. Every child here contributed to the design, from the paint colors to the artwork to the layout. This is proof that when we believe in their abilities, they will show us something extraordinary." The audience burst into applause, many wiping away tears. The performances that followed made it impossible for anyone to sit still. A group of children in wheelchairs performed a synchronized circle dance, their wheels spinning to the rhythm of the music, creating a scene both beautiful and deeply moving. A boy who had once only been able to sit still now confidently used his prosthetic arms to beat a drum, the lively rhythm sparking cheers that echoed throughout the space. Malik also stepped forward, performing with a group of friends a dance combining footsteps and crutch rhythms. His movements were no longer hesitant, but steady and full of energy. When he bowed, the entire crowd rose to their feet, and the sound of applause crashed like waves. Adrian sat in the audience, his eyes misty. He didn't see a group of disabled children, he saw a generation of courage. He turned to look at Malik, who was bowing with confidence, and he realized he was witnessing a moment that redefined everything. The families around him couldn't hide their emotions either. They held their children close, many in tears as they realized their own kids could do the same. In that joyful morning, the long-held sense of isolation melted away, replaced by a shared community that stood together. As the ceremony came to a close, hundreds of people lingered in the courtyard, talking and holding hands. The children kept playing, their footsteps, the sounds of wheelchairs, and their laughter blending into a symphony. Aisha looked around, her face glowing with happiness. Adrian stepped closer, his gaze softer, stripped of its usual pride. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition that what she and the children had created went far beyond any contract or business deal he had ever known. Step Forward had become a symbol, not of pity, but of freedom. A place where dreams were inaugurated by brave hands and hearts. After the emotional opening acts, the atmosphere in the courtyard soared even higher. The host stepped forward, smiling as he announced the day's most important performance. A show choreographed entirely by the Step Forward students themselves. The crowd fell silent. All eyes turned to the stage. Malik stood at the front, his eyes glowing, his stance steady, surprising everyone who saw him. He was no longer the shy boy hiding behind adults. He stood now like a young leader, confidently guiding his friends. On his shoulder, the brace felt lighter than ever, a symbol of his journey through hardship, and also like wings ready to unfold. The music started, deep and then rising in intensity. Malik lifted his foot, each of his first steps slow but determined, setting the rhythm for the group behind him. The other children joined in, some with crutches, some in wheelchairs, all moving together with the beat. Movements that once seemed awkward turned into a unique dance, where each crutch tap and wheel spin became both sound and image of strength. Malik raised his hand, leading the formation, his eyes focused but his smile wide, and that smile spread confidence to every member of the group. The audience held their breath, many witnessing for the first time a performance where difference wasn't a burden, but the soul of the show. Parents were moved to tears. They had seen their children silent, rejected in typical classrooms, now watching them shine under the lights, confident as if they had never been hurt. Malik continued to lead, his every gesture blending strength and grace, firm, yet full of emotion. The music reached its climax, and the group moved in unison for the final move. Crutches lifted high, wheelchairs spinning together into a perfect circle. Malik stood at the center, arms outstretched, head held high with pride. That moment made the entire crowd erupt. Applause roared and echoed through the courtyard. Children screamed in excitement, adults leapt to their feet, reporters snapped photos, and camera flashes burst in waves. The stage seemed to be swept into a storm of emotion. Amid the cheers, Adrian sat in one of the back rows, quietly watching. He looked at his son, heart aching from emotion, though his face remained calm. For years, he had been used to standing in the spotlight, where every decision was praised or debated. But today, he didn't need the lights, nor did he seek recognition. He let that light shine fully on Malik and the other children, so they could feel what it meant to lead. As the performance ended, the entire courtyard exploded in applause. Adrian sat still for a few seconds, his vision blurred, his hand trembling slightly. Then he raised it and slowly clapped in rhythm, his applause coming last, but clearly enough to blend into the wave already spreading. No one noticed him, and for the first time, he felt happiness in that. This was Malik's moment, Aisha's moment, the moment of all the children who had once been pushed aside, not the moment of a billionaire trying to prove his power. Malik bowed to the audience, his eyes searching for his father in the crowd. When he saw Adrian smiling, quietly clapping, his chest tightened with emotion. He understood his father was there, not needing to speak, not needing to step on stage. But that quiet presence was the greatest acknowledgement of all. Aisha stood nearby and met Adrian's eyes. They exchanged a single nod, wordless but full of meaning. The ceremony ended in laughter, but its resonance lingered. For many, it was just a community performance. But for Adrian, it marked the moment he proved he could step back and let his son lead. For the first time in his life, he understood that pride didn't have to mean standing at the center of the spotlight. Real pride came from watching someone you love stand there, and knowing that clapping quietly from the edge was more than enough. As the months passed, the story of Step Forward extended far beyond the scope of a small center. Images of children walking, spinning, and laughing in the newly lit room appeared repeatedly across media outlets, becoming symbols of resilience and aspiration. News of a once cold, arrogant billionaire stepping back to let his son and a woman of color lead a humanitarian journey stirred public attention everywhere. Numerous social organizations, universities, and even international human rights groups took notice, seeing it as a rare example of change rooted in belief in people. When the official invitation arrived, announcing that Aisha and Adrian would be honored at an awards ceremony hosted by a renowned human rights organization, the entire Step Forward community erupted in joy. On the day of the ceremony, the hall was flooded with light, the orchestra played with dignity, and hundreds of guests from various countries were present. On stage, a large banner read, "Honor and Justice." capturing the spirit of the event. Aisha stood beside Adrian, her face composed, though her eyes betrayed emotion. When their names were announced, the entire audience rose in a standing ovation, applause roaring like a wave. Malik sat in the front row, his eyes glowing with pride, his hand gripping his crutch as if to pass strength to his father and Aisha. The host introduced them in a clear, steady voice. These are two individuals from opposite worlds, who together proved that justice is not a luxury. It begins with giving a chance to the children society forgot. Applause followed, cameras flashing non-stop as they stepped up to accept the award. Aisha spoke first. She didn't speak long. She recounted the journey from the old warehouse, from the looks of dismissal to the moment the children found their own rhythm. She ended with the words, "My honor is not in this award, but in every firm step the children take. Justice doesn't come from grand building. It comes from a heart that chooses to believe." The room fell into deep silence, then burst into applause, with many standing and bowing. When it was Adrian's turn, he stepped forward, hand gripping the microphone, eyes meeting the lenses of hundreds of cameras. Reporters jostled, their microphones nearly touching the podium. A voice rang out, blunt and cold. "Do you regret once looking down on her?" The question exposed a past he had long avoided, but today, under these lights, he couldn't remain silent. The entire hall waited, a long pause stretching as everyone held their breath. Adrian took a deep breath. His shoulders trembled slightly, but his voice rang out clearly. "Yes, I regret it." He paused, his eyes turning to Aisha standing beside him, then back to the row where Malik was watching. "I once looked down on her because I believed power and money were enough to define a person. I was wrong. Aisha taught me that honor cannot be bought with contracts. And justice isn't built from glass towers, but from the courage to rise when others expect you to kneel. I regret being blind, but today, that very regret has brought me here, to bow before a woman to whom I owe a lifelong lesson." The applause erupted, not the polite kind often heard at elegant ceremonies, but loud, unified, and charged with emotion and respect. Many wiped away tears. Others stood and raised their fists, a symbol of solidarity. Aisha turned to Adrian, and in her eyes there was no longer confrontation, there was recognition. Adrian gave a small nod, a faint smile crossing his face, not one of pride, but of a man who had found justice within his own heart. Malik jumped up, his crutches striking the floor with a sharp thud that startled a few people, but then everyone laughed as he raised his hand and shouted, "My dad and I are proud of Step Forward." His voice echoed through the hall, turning the formal ceremony into a moment of pure, vibrant life. Journalists captured the moment in full, aware they were witnessing not just an awards event, but a rare transformation of both people and justice. The ceremony ended in warm light, in real congratulations, in genuine handshakes. Adrian stepped down and wrapped his arms tightly around Malik, and for the first time in many years, he felt he was standing at the place where honor and justice met, not because of power, but because he had dared to change. Applause still roared through the hall, and yet the focus remained. Adrian stood still for a moment, breathing deeply to regain his composure. He knew he had just admitted something he had never dared to say in public, but one sentence remained unspoken, stirring within him. His eyes turned to Aisha, the woman who stood calm and steady, hands clasped, her face serene after all the storms. Adrian raised the microphone once more, his voice lower but steady. "I'm grateful she never looked down on me." The words fell like warm water, unexpected and sincere. The entire room fell briefly silent, then quieted further to take it in. Adrian continued, his eyes fixed on Aisha. "I once had the power to impose, to remove anyone who displeased me. If Aisha had treated me the way I treated her, I'd probably still be an arrogant man in a cold tower. But she didn't look down on me. She chose to let me witness my son laughing, walking, and through that, learn how to be a father. I'm grateful she didn't close the door, even when I deserved it." His final words echoed, as if he weren't speaking at a ceremony, but revealing the truth buried in his heart. The audience listened closely, many faces reflecting emotion. They weren't just seeing a billionaire admit his mistakes, but a man placing his gratitude where it truly belonged. Malik sat in the front row, eyes brimming with tears. He turned to the person beside him and whispered, voice trembling, "I've never seen my dad speak like that." Camera flashes continued, but this time, not with the urgency of pursuit, more like an effort to preserve a rare moment of personal transformation. Aisha listened to every word. At first her expression was serious, but then the corner of her mouth lifted. She bowed her head slightly, shoulders trembling, as if trying to hide a smile. When Adrian finished, she let out a laugh, not mocking, but gentle, a release of all the tension. The audience joined in with soft laughter, and the room, once heavy, suddenly felt lighter. That laughter made many exhale, as if they had just witnessed two former adversaries reach true understanding and forgiveness. Adrian was momentarily surprised by Aisha's laughter, but then he smiled too, a rare, simple smile. In that moment, the distance that once separated them seemed to vanish. It was no longer a relationship of power, no longer a tug-of-war between control and resistance, but simply two people standing on the same stage, united by a belief that justice could reshape destiny. Another round of applause broke out, not loud or thunderous, but warm and intimate. A few people stood and bowed slightly, as if witnessing an important reconciliation. Aisha turned to Adrian, her face brighter than ever, her eyes filled with relief. Malik saw it all, and his heart swelled, knowing that his father was no longer a man fighting alone, but someone who had truly found an ally. The ceremony ended in a completely different atmosphere from how it began. As they stepped off the stage, Adrian walked beside Aisha. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. Reporters crowded in, cameras followed, but instead of harsh questions, many smiled, and a few even joked, "Mr. Stone, after today, would you still dare to look down on anyone?" The whole crowd laughed, and Adrian just shook his head, his voice low but clear. "I've learned that lesson." In the brilliant lights of the hall, laughter still lingered, and everyone understood that no matter how many challenges lay ahead, the moment when a man bowed his head to thank someone he once dismissed, and a woman responded with a relieved smile, was enough to carve the words honor and justice into the hearts of all who were there that day. As Step Forward gradually stabilized, Malik began a new journey, this time not just within the familiar practice room, but in the school environment. He returned to class after a long absence, still accompanied by his crutches, but with a completely different presence. Malik no longer lowered his head to avoid stares. He entered the classroom with a bright smile, eyes sparkling as if to tell everyone he was ready. His steps, though not perfect, landed with confidence, making it clear he was no longer a victim of an accident, but living proof of the power of will. His classmates, who had once pitied or avoided him, now looked at him with surprise and admiration. That day, something shifted. The energy in the room changed, and Malik's presence brought a strange, powerful force. In the days that followed, Malik adapted faster than anyone expected. Instead of quietly sitting at the back, he actively joined everything from academics to the arts. When teachers invited him to share his recovery journey, Malik stood up, smiled, his voice not yet strong, but each word filled with confidence. "I once thought I would never walk again, but I was wrong. I found my own rhythm, and I want to tell everyone that each of us can find our own path." The class fell silent, then suddenly burst into applause. His peers didn't just admire him, they began to approach him, talk to him, share their own struggle, hoping for encouragement. Malik realized that while his legs might be weaker, his voice had the power to lift others. Once, during a school assembly with the theme, "Overcoming Limits," the principal unexpectedly invited Malik to speak. First, he hesitated, but the encouraging looks from his friends and Aisha's nodding smile at the back of the room gave him strength. Malik stepped up to the podium, hand gripping his crutch, but his voice rang out firm and clear. "Limits aren't walls that block us. They're steps that help us rise. I used to be scared, used to feel different, but that difference helped me see that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about daring to stand up after you fall." His words were simple, full of truth and lived experience. The hall sat in silence. Then applause exploded like thunder. Even many teachers were moved. From that day on, Malik became the school's young speaker, often invited to share in other classes, his story igniting strength in students quietly battling their own struggles. What made Malik's classmates admire him wasn't just the increasingly steady steps, but the resilience he radiated. On days when the weather changed and his legs ached terribly, he still showed up to class with patience, still smiled when friends checked on him. Once, he fell in the schoolyard. Laughter echoed from somewhere, but Malik didn't cry. He got up, brushed off the dust, and continued. That image taught his friends that courage didn't need grand words. It lived in how someone faced even the smallest failures. Many began reflecting on themselves, feeling ashamed for complaining about low grades or minor setbacks, while Malik kept moving forward on aching legs. Malik also encouraged his classmates to join activities connected to Step Forward. A group of students regularly visited the center, helped paint the walls, played instruments for the kids, and together turned the space into a place of joy. Some even confided that thanks to Malik, they had come to understand the value of sharing. Gradually, he was no longer the disabled boy at school, but someone who led, who inspired. Teachers placed their trust in him, and classmates saw him as a symbol of strength. During a literature class, the teacher asked students to write about my hero. When reading the essays, he was surprised to find more than half the class had chosen Malik. The pages overflowed with stories of persistence, of his smile, of how he never gave up. Malik read the papers, his eyes blurred, but his heart was full of joy. He had never imagined he would become a role model for others, but now his determination had made it real. Adrian was present at some of Malik's presentations. He sat quietly in the back, hands clasped, never stepping in, never taking the spotlight. He watched his son stand tall before a crowd, remembering the first moment Malik tried to walk and step forward. His heart clenched. Not with worry, but with pure pride. He understood now that his son didn't need him at the center, just needed him in the background, quietly applauding. And that's what he did, so Malik would know his father was always there, even as the light now rightfully belonged to him. As the days passed, Malik was no longer just a returning student. He had truly become a young speaker, guiding both peers and adults. He proved that resilience wasn't some distant trait. It could be found in every step taken, in every time someone stood back up. His friends admired him, his teachers felt proud, and Malik simply smiled, knowing his journey was far from over. It was only beginning. The BOY, once seen as a burden, had become a small guiding light, not just for himself, but for all those searching for the strength to move forward. School gatherings gradually became a place where Adrian regularly appeared, not as a powerful figure, but simply as a father sitting quietly in the back row. He watched Malik in every moment. From the way he greeted friends, responded to teachers, to the times he stood before hundreds of eyes to share his story. In the past, Adrian had believed that a father's duty was to control, to give commands and direction. But seeing Malik stand firm and confident, he realized there was no need to intervene anymore. His son had found his own voice and rhythm, something no wealth or influence could ever provide. In class, Malik spoke with the passion of a true speaker. He shared his journey from those early days walking with braces to the moment he realized he could walk on his own. His voice echoed, his eyes shone, and his smile spread across the room. His classmates listened intently, their eyes fixed on him. Adrian sat in the back of the room, heart filled with pride, though his face remained calm, because he knew his role now was to step back. He didn't need to stand in the spotlight or give orders. He only needed to witness Malik walk the path he had chosen, and that alone was the greatest reward. One day, the school held a parent event. Instead of Adrian speaking as usual, Malik was invited. He walked steadily to the podium with his crutches, then looked out at the room with a gentle smile. "I used to think I couldn't fit in, but thanks to those who believed in me, I found my own rhythm. I believe everyone has a beat to walk to, and when we find it, we can lead others to." His words rang out naturally, drawing admiration from the whole room. Adrian sat still, hand resting on his knee, eyes never leaving his son, not with control, but with curiosity and respect. After that event, many parents approached Adrian, not to ask about business ventures or investments, but to ask how Malik had grown into the person he was. Adrian simply smiled and answered, "He's taught me more than I've taught him." The response surprised some, but to Adrian, it was a simple truth. He saw his son transform every limitation into strength, and in doing so, had guided him to let go of control. One afternoon, the two of them sat in the small garden behind Step Forward, soft sunlight falling through the trees. Malik walked slow laps along the tiled path with his crutches. Adrian sat on a stone bench, eyes following his son, offering no advice. Malik turned around, beaming, then suddenly said, "Now it's my turn to lead you." The words stopped Adrian in his tracks. All his life, he had led, imposed, and expected others to follow. Malik's words sliced clean through that old pride. And instead of resisting, Adrian let out a quiet laugh, a lightness spreading through his chest. Malik walked slowly toward his father and reached out his hand as if inviting him. "Come with me, not to check, but to feel." Adrian looked at that small hand, its fingers marked with calluses from training, and saw in his son's eyes a quiet resolve. He placed his own hand in Malik's, his larger palm enclosing it, yet feeling as if he were the one being led. The two walked side by side, one a seasoned man of business just learning how to listen, the other with an imperfect body but a heart burning bright. Their footsteps echoed on the tiled path, blending with the evening birdsong, as if confirming that the time had come for roles to shift. From that day forward, Adrian no longer saw himself as the teacher, but the student. He learned patience from Malik, learned how to smile through failure, and even learned to find joy in the smallest thing. At every session, he sat quietly, no longer interrupting the rhythm, letting his son lead. Malik kept growing, and each time he spoke, Adrian felt a light flicker inside himself. The words, "Now it's my turn to lead you," were no longer playful. They had become the compass for the rest of his journey, one led by the child once seen as fragile, now the strongest guide of all. As the sun set, Adrian suddenly realized he had never felt so free. Not the freedom of someone who owned an empire, but the freedom of a father who had learned to let go and follow his son's path. Malik sat beside him, and both remained silent. No more words needed. In that stillness, Adrian understood that the light he once chased out in the world was nothing compared to the light shining from his son's heart. And for the first time, he didn't just feel like a father. He felt like a companion on the road Malik was now leading. From a small center rebuilt on the foundation of an old warehouse, Step Forward gradually became a symbol many sought out. News outlets continued to report on it, social organizations looked to learn from it, and families with children with disabilities from all over began sending letters, hoping to join. Aisha and Adrian received hundreds of invitations from different cities, where parent communities longed for a similar home. And then, within just 1 year, Step Forward opened its first branch in a nearby city. No longer a dim little room, the new facility was built with help from many volunteers. But what made it special was that every design still carried the original spirit. Colors chosen by the children, and spaces arranged so each child could find freedom in movement. The success of the second branch lit a fire in a vault of belief. Before long, other cities had centers just like it. Cracked old walls were replaced with vibrant colors, old speakers upgraded to modern sound system, but the core spirit remained: to let children find their own rhythm, to create their own dance. Parents walked in holding their children's hands, many unable to hide their tears as they watched them laugh. Not in a clinical therapy session, but in an unexpected dance. Malik often joined Aisha at opening days, always standing in the center of a new circle of friends, inspiring them with his proud smile and familiar line, "Let us lead ourselves." The spread didn't stop within small communities. Medical professionals began paying attention to the method Step Forward had adopted. They gave it a simple name: autonomous rhythm. Scientific journals published articles. Studies showed that when children were encouraged to find their own pace, the brain formed stronger new connections than through traditional therapy. Major hospitals were surprised by the results and gradually began incorporating the method into rehabilitation programs. Therapy rooms, once stiff and filled with cold machines, now echoed with music. Nurses and doctors were trained not to direct, but to become companions, encouraging children to discover their own path. There were moments that drew global attention. A video taken at a central hospital showing a young girl in a wheelchair bursting into joyful laughter as she spun herself around spread quickly across social media. People spoke of Step Forward as a small revolution in community medicine. In one interview, Adrian simply smiled and said, "The credit belongs to the children. They taught us that the body can be slow, but the heart never retreats." That quote was repeated often, printed on posters, and echoed all the way to international conferences. Malik continued to play a central role in the story. He was no longer the shy child, but a young speaker at numerous medical conferences, where doctors listened with respect. He spoke about the early days when he relied entirely on his father, about the unsteady steps after removing his brace, and about the joy of being guided not by a firm grip but by trust. Many rose to applaud, not out of pity, but because they saw in him a living testament that science and belief could meet. Aisha maintained her simple approach, never claiming to have created the method. She always said, "I just opened the door." They were the ones who walked through it. But to the community, she was seen as the one who lit the path. Alongside Adrian, she continued to oversee new centers, ensuring that the spirit of freedom and humanity would not be reduced to empty slogans. They turned away investors who wanted to turn Step Forward into a luxury brand, firmly protecting its original purpose: a place where children made their own choices. The story that began in an old room had now become a spreading journey, bringing hope thousands of families across cities. Music-filled therapy room. The sound of crutches on wooden floors became the rhythm of resilience. Adrian, once a man who only understood power and profit, now stood before the public acknowledging that his greatest lessons came from his son and from Aisha. Malik, with his radiant smile, now led not only his father, but a world learning to walk to its own beat. And in every retelling of the story, people came to understand that autonomous rhythm was not just a medical method, it was a way of life, a reminder that justice, honor, and hope begin with the courage to take the first step. The powerful spread of Step Forward didn't stop at cities or hospitals. It reached back toward those who once sowed disdain. As public discourse intensified, a video resurfaced showing a group of police officers entering the center, laughter, mocking the children. It quickly spread across social media. Their cold stares and sneering laughter were contrasted with footage of Malik and his friends dancing confidently at the opening of a new center. Outrage grew. Thousands demanded justice. Editorials condemned the abuse of authority, calling it a stain that could not be left in silence. Under mounting pressure, the police department was forced to launch an investigation, and the result was a wave of disciplinary action. Some officers were demoted, others suspended, and their names were made public, a warning that society would no longer tolerate ridicule aimed at the vulnerable. When news of the disciplinary actions was made public, no one at Step Forward cheered with satisfaction. Aisha remained silent, her expression calm. To her, punishment was not about revenge, but about showing the children that justice might be slow, but it exists. Malik listened as his father told him the story, nodded softly, his eyes bright but his voice gentle. "I just want them to see we're not a joke." That simple sentence was enough for Adrian to understand that all these transformations had helped his son truly grow, not to see the world through bitterness, but through a desire to be seen as human. Around the same time, the National Child Rights Organization announced a prestigious award honoring individuals with exceptional contributions. Aisha's name was called to a thunderous round of applause, and the entire hall rose to greet her. She walked to the stage in a simple dress, her steps graceful, her gaze unwavering. When the shining trophy was placed in her hands, reporters pushed in to take photos, and the host announced, "This is the woman who turned a method into a community movement, bringing hope to thousands of children." The entire room erupted in cheers. But when the microphone was handed to her, Aisha only smiled, her voice soft yet firm. "The credit is not mine. The credit belongs to the children who bravely taught us that the body does not define dignity. They stood firm to remind society that everyone deserves respect. I was just the one beside them. The true light came from them." Her words brought a brief silence to the room, followed by thunderous applause. Many wiped away tears, moved by the rare sight of someone refusing the spotlight and returning it to the children. Malik sat among the guests, his eyes wide with pride. He whispered to the friend beside him, "That's why I believe in Ms. Aisha." Adrian, sitting behind him, remained quiet, his eyes shining. He realized that all the great things he had once pursued had never earned the kind of genuine respect this moment did. Because here, honor was not born from power, but from the simple truth that vulnerable children had turned pain into strength. As Aisha stepped down from the stage, reporters surrounded her, but she took the hand of a girl in a wheelchair and brought her onto the stage to hold the trophy together. That image appeared on the front pages the next day, with bold headlines reading, "Aisha's glory is in the children's smiles." To the entire country, that award became proof that justice doesn't only live in courtrooms, but also in small rooms, where crutches and laughter move to the rhythm of belief. In the hearts of Adrian and Malik, that night was not just about honoring one person. It was a moment that sealed the truth that justice only endures when honor is shared. And from that day on, the story of Step Forward was no longer a movement, but a belief deeply rooted in the community. 1 year had passed since Step Forward reopened, a span of time that played out like a vivid film, marking every effort, every drop of sweat, and every moment once thought impossible. The 1-year anniversary was held right in the center courtyard, a place that had witnessed countless hardships, now dressed in the vibrant spirit of celebration. From early morning, parents and children gathered, planting flags, hanging banners, and setting up small booths, selling sweets and drinks made by their own families. The air was filled with laughter, and everyone was joyful, knowing that the place once just an old warehouse had become a living symbol of faith and resilience. Malik appeared in a crisp white shirt, standing taller than when he first came to the center. In his hand was no longer a pair of heavy crutches, but a lightweight cane made just for him, enough to provide balance and serve as a reminder of the journey he had traveled. He stepped into the center of the temporary stage, his eyes lighting up as his companions clapped and cheered. Malik took a deep breath, his face glowing with the confidence of a young man who had overcome himself. Aisha stepped out from behind, still dressed simply, but with eyes sparkling with pride. She approached Malik and extended her hand, not to support him, but to invite him. Malik smiled and placed his hand in hers. The music began, not the old familiar tunes from worn-out speakers, but a new melody composed by the children and volunteers, both joyful and dignified. The crowd fell silent as Malik began his first steps, the light cane tapping rhythmically on the wooden floor, its sound steady, a declaration that he had grown and was ready to lead. The dance was not elaborate, just simple steps combined with gentle turns. But what moved the audience was the image of Malik leading and Aisha following. A year ago, she had placed her hand in his trembling one, but now the roles had reversed. Malik led with confidence, his cane setting the pace, his eyes shining with every moment. Aisha could not hide her emotion, allowing Malik full control of the rhythm, each of her steps following his, a testament to the truth that the once fragile boy had become the one who now showed the way. The crowd clapped along, many parents wiping away tears. Other children cheered, some stood and tapped their crutches to the beat. Others in wheelchairs spun their wheels with lifted hands. The entire center courtyard became a collective dance, where limits faded into laughter, applause, and music. Adrian stood quietly in the back row, his eyes blurred with emotion, but a rare, gentle smile spread across his face. He did not step forward or speak, just clapped along with everyone else, knowing that this moment belonged to Malik and Aisha, and to all who had believed and never given up. When the music ended, Malik came to a stop, his cane steady in hand, his face glowing. He lifted his head high, looked around at the audience, then bowed. Applause rang out endlessly, as if everyone wanted to hold on to the moment forever. Aisha stood beside him, her hand still in Malik's, and together they bowed in gratitude. In that instant, painful memories, humiliation, and the times he had fallen all seemed to fade, leaving only faith and pride. The anniversary celebration ended, but its echoes lingered. Families stayed behind to talk, children kept playing around the courtyard, and the warm yellow lights made the setting feel even more inviting. Malik sat with his friend, his cane resting beside him, his smile brighter than ever before. In everyone's eyes, he was no longer the disabled boy, but a symbol of resilience. And Step Forward, after a year full of upheavals, had proven that it was not just a rehabilitation center, but a home, a starting point for dreams. As the celebration wrapped up, Adrian slowly walked over to his son without saying a word, gently patting Malik's shoulder. Malik looked up, his eyes shining, and softly said, "I kept my promise." Adrian nodded lightly, with no need for another word. In that moment, they both understood the journey ahead was still long, but what mattered was that Malik could now lead the way. And the image of Step Forward on its first anniversary, with the dance Malik led alongside Aisha, became a symbol of the future, an ending not yet closed, full of promise for the stories still to come. After a performance that set the entire courtyard alight, the crowd still couldn't stop talking. Cameras kept flashing, lenses sweeping to catch every smile, every tear shed from emotion. Malik sat resting next to Aisha, his hand trembling slightly but his eyes glowing, as if he had just stepped through a new door. In the distance, Adrian stood surrounded by reporters, his expression calm as always, but his eyes had changed, no longer cold, now filled with a quiet depth. A young journalist pushed forward through the crowd, raised a microphone and asked clearly, "Mr. Stone, after everything, what have you learned?" The question fell into silence, freezing the crowd, with only the sharp flash of cameras lighting Adrian's face. He raised his eyebrows slightly, as if weighing the answer. In that moment, a flood of memories rushed through his mind. Seeing Malik wobble on his braces for the first time, the anger at being mocked, the night the center was destroyed, the moment his son led the dance with Aisha, and the day of the reopening, when he had quietly clapped from the back. Every memory stacked like scenes from a film, reminding him that this journey was not only Malik's transformation, but his own. Adrian took a deep breath, his hands resting on the wooden podium, and spoke in a low but steady voice. "Real power isn't in leading, it's in knowing when to follow." That sentence sent a ripple through the open-air venue. Reporters froze, pens scrambled, cameras instantly zoomed in. Adrian didn't stop. He went on, his eyes locking with Malik's. "I used to think a leader must always be in front, giving orders, showing the way. But my son taught me that sometimes we need to step back and let others lead. Following doesn't mean weakness. It shows strength and trust. I've learned that the greatest value of power doesn't lie in the light that shines on us, but in the moment we allow that light to shine on someone else." His words echoed, not as a rehearsed speech, but as a confession from the heart. The applause didn't come all at once, but scattered, then built up rapidly, until the entire courtyard turned into a roaring wave. Aisha stood nearby, a faint smile appearing on her face, not of triumph, but of quiet relief that Adrian had finally grasped what she had spent years trying to prove. Malik looked at his father, eyes glistening, then gently tapped his cane on the wooden floor, as if answering the words with a gesture. In that moment, all boundaries of generation, status, and authority authority seemed to dissolve, leaving only connection. Another reporter raised a hand, voice trembling with emotion. "Do you regret it, losing so much to gain what you have today?" Adrian shook his head and answered slowly. "If the price of honor and justice was losing those who stood beside me only for power, then it wasn't a loss. I found real friends in the people I once dismissed, and in the eyes of my own son. There is no regret here, only gratitude." His words brought many to tears. The contrast too stark between the once cold billionaire and the humble, sincere man now standing on stage. The atmosphere of Step Forward's one-year anniversary became something more. It was no longer just a celebration of a center, but a turning point in perspective. Families with disabilities held hands, children laughed, and journalists took notes as if this was a story meant to be retold for years to come. As the soft light of dusk settled, Adrian stood beside Malik and Aisha, three people from three different worlds now united in one shared rhythm. When the event ended, no one rushed to leave. Malik sat on a bench, cane beside him, his smile beaming as friends crowded around to congratulate him. Aisha spoke with parents, her eyes glowing with fresh hope. Adrian stood back quiet, arms folded, not stepping into the spotlight, choosing instead to observe. Inside him, the answer he had just given continued to echo, reminding him that this journey wasn't over, but it had already taught him the true nature of power and love. In the final moment before leaving, Malik walked up and took his father's hand, his eyes shining bright. "I'm proud that you let me lead the way." Adrian leaned down, gently replied, "I'm proud that you gave me the chance to follow." They looked at each other, smiles blooming beneath the rising moon. And just like that, the story didn't end with a period, but with a new beginning, where power was redefined, not by how far one leads, but by the moment one chooses to follow those who deserve to lead. A year of turbulence had passed, and the story that began at a cold banquet in Regency Hall closed with a vibrant celebration at Step Forward, where hundreds of children and parents smiled hand in hand. Looking back on the journey, we see a profound transformation, not only in a boy bound by steel braces, a woman of color once dismissed as a servant, but also in a father whose life had long revolved around pride and control. The thread connecting these three people was woven from moments that seemed fragile, when an awkward dance reignited the flame of belief that society had long tried to extinguish. Malik stood at the heart of that chain. From a boy who collapsed after an accident, he found new meaning within the space of Step Forward, where music and rhythm replaced rigid routines. He learned to smile when falling, to feel pride even when leaning on a cane, and eventually, he stood on stage, leading his peers, inspiring a generation. Malik didn't just learn to walk again with what was left of his legs. More importantly, he taught his father how to step back, and taught society how to see dignity in difference. That boy turned pain into power, and his resilience became the clearest proof that limits can be the starting point of a great journey. Aisha was the soul of the story, the one who lit the lantern when darkness closed in. From the position of a disregarded server, she stepped beyond the fence of prejudice to reach for Malik, proving that a single dance could erase humiliation. From that moment, Aisha became a protector, not only shielding a child, but boldly confronting those in power. When the center was destroyed, she did not crumble, and when mocked, she did not retreat. She allowed Malik to find his rhythm, without imposing or controlling, and it was this trust that nurtured a generation of children who dared to believe in themselves. Aisha's lasting lesson was one of conviction, that justice is not handed down from above, but cultivated through the courage of ordinary people who dare to say no to contempt. Adrian was the mirror of a long and painful awakening. He had once been a billionaire who believed money could solve everything, who saw his son as a source of shame, who treated Aisha as someone beneath him. But each event forced him to reflect. From anger at being rejected to standing silently among the ruins of Step Forward, he slowly realized that absolute control only created emptiness in the heart. The words, "True power lies not in leading, but in the moment we choose to follow," became the greatest conclusion of his life. Adrian finally learned that sometimes courage is not found in being at the front, but in stepping back to let someone else shine, especially when that someone is your own son. The story does not end with personal victories, but opens a wider vision of society. The image of mocking police officers, furious shareholders obsessed with profit, and vandals striking under cover of night reveals that prejudice and abuse of power still exist. But alongside them were parents painting walls, volunteers rebuilding classrooms, journalists brave enough to tell the truth. That contrast reflects two faces of society, one clinging to division, the other fighting to dismantle it. Step Forward became the answer, a small but steadfast symbol that humanity can prevail. The first inspiring lesson is the power of belief. Malik could not have moved forward without believing he deserved his own rhythm. Aisha could not have defended the center without believing justice was worth more than money. Adrian could not have changed without believing that love was stronger than power. That belief, once sparked, spread like a wave, drawing public support for Step Forward and forcing thousands to reevaluate how society treats the vulnerable. The second lesson is the meaning of stepping back. In modern life, everyone wants to lead, to prove they are superior. But Adrian's story shows that true happiness can come from letting others lead. When he clapped last, when he sat in the back row and let Malik take the spotlight, that was when he found true freedom. Power was no longer about control, but about the ability to place trust. The third lesson is that justice begins with the ordinary, not in courtrooms or political halls, but in a small practice room, when a child finds their smile, when a parent stops bowing their head. That is already justice. Recognition and respect do not need grand speeches, only simple actions, listening, trusting, and holding hands. And the final lesson is the strength of community. One person can be mocked, one center can be destroyed, but when hundreds stand together, that strength cannot be stopped. Step Forward was rebuilt not by Adrian's wealth, but by the belief and unity of many. It was the community that turned this place into a home for dreams. At the end of the story, what stays with the audience is not just Malik's dance or Adrian's words of gratitude, but the message that anyone, no matter how small or fragile, can become a guide. Sometimes a simple action, like Aisha placing her hand in Malik's during the banquet, can mark the beginning of a journey of transformation. What matters is not where you begin, but the courage to step forward, to believe, to follow the rhythm of the heart. On the first anniversary, when Malik led the dance with his light cane, when Adrian quietly clapped and Aisha smiled, the story came to a close in a way that opened the future. A future where children once seen as burdens are now met with respect, where a father learns to bow his head so his son can lead the way, and where a woman once looked down upon becomes a symbol of justice. It is a reminder that each of us can change, can take part in writing the next verse of humanity's dance of freedom, as long as we believe that limits are only the starting point for greater dreams.